Welcome, wanderers. As the moon hangs heavy and the world outside falls silent, let the shadows in your room deepen and your guard fall. For the next 3 hours, we're diving into tales of the chilling and the unknown. Stories specifically crafted to lull you into an uneasy rest. So dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and prepare to drift into a slumber haunted by whispers from the dark. Comment down below where you're listening from and drop a like in the name of fear. The old hunting lodge, nestled deep within the Blackwood Peaks, wasn't just remote. It felt like a scar on the face of the earth. Its weathered timber walls sagged, its windows were perpetually misted, and a perpetual chill clung to its very stones, even in the height of summer. For Liam, Chloe, Sam, and Maya, it was meant to be an escape, a desperate attempt to outrun the silent, suffocating weight that had settled over their lives. They had been inseparable since college, a quartet bound by shared dreams and late-night talks. But somewhere along the winding road of adulthood, the light had faded. Liam, the quiet artist, hadn't touched a brush in months, his studio gathering dust like a forgotten tune. Chloe, the outwardly cheerful one, maintained her bright facade with a terrifying fragility, her eyes betraying a deep, unyielding weariness. Sam, the cynical joker, found his wit turning bitter, his laughter hollow. And Maya, the meticulous academic, was drowning in a sea of research papers she could no longer comprehend, her sharp mind dulled by an endless fog. Their collective depression, a silent, insidious fifth member of their group, had become an unspoken pact of misery. The idea for the retreat had been Chloe's, a last-ditch effort to reconnect with nature and ourselves. Liam had nodded vaguely, Sam had snorted a sarcastic remark about therapy in the wilderness, and Maya had merely stared at her laptop screen, unseeing. Yet they had come. Anything was better than the suffocating familiarity of their own apartments, each a monument to their individual despair. The lodge, however, offered no solace. The moment they stepped inside, the chill intensified, a damp, clinging cold that seeped into their bones, no matter how many layers they wore. It wasn't just the temperature. It was a pervasive sense of profound emptiness, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something subtly metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. Their first night was filled with forced cheer. Chloe unpacked board games. Sam poured cheap whiskey. Liam stared into the crackling, reluctant fire, and Maya tried to read, her eyes scanning lines without registering meaning. But the lodge seemed to listen. Every creak of the old timbers, every groan of settling foundations, felt amplified, deliberate. The silence between their strained conversations was heavy, expectant. Then came the sounds. It started subtly, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls of Liam's room, directly behind his bed. Not frantic, like a mouse, but slow, deliberate, almost purposeful, like nails dragging on plaster. He tried to rationalize it, a loose floorboard in the room above, a branch against the exterior. But the tapping persisted, a maddening rhythm that often continued for hours, sometimes accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. He'd press his ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment he focused, the sound would invariably fade, leaving him in the oppressive, damp silence of his room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts. Chloe, meanwhile, found herself plagued by phantom laughter. Not the joyful sound she so desperately tried to project, but a thin, reedy giggle that seemed to emanate from the empty corners of the kitchen, especially when she was alone, trying to force herself to cook. It was undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy, a sound of ancient, malicious amusement. She'd spin around, clutching a saucepan, only to find nothing but the oppressive silence and the pervasive cold. It made her forced smiles crack, revealing the raw despair beneath. Sam, ever the cynic, started hearing his own voice, distorted and mocking, whispering his deepest insecurities back to him from the shadows of the common room. Worthless. Failure. Everyone sees it. He'd snap back, "Shut up," only to be met with silence, and the chilling realization that no one else had heard it. His sarcasm became a frantic defense, aimed at invisible tormentors. Maya, in her attempt to find solace in logic, began to notice her meticulously organized research notes scattering themselves across the floor, or pages turning on their own in her open books. One night, she watched, horrified, as a pen rolled across the table and began to draw a series of intricate, swirling symbols on a blank page, symbols she didn't recognize, yet felt ancient and deeply unsettling. The air around her grew thick with the scent of ozone, like after a lightning strike. They tried to talk about it, huddled around the sputtering fireplace, their faces pale in the flickering light. "Are you guys hearing things?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Chloe nodded, her eyes wide and tearful. "The laughter, it's everywhere." Sam just stared into his whiskey glass. "My own damn voice, telling me I'm a joke." Maya, however, tried to rationalize. "It's the isolation, the stress, the old house settling. Our minds are playing tricks on us." But even as she spoke, her gaze darted nervously towards the shadows, her voice lacking its usual conviction. Their shared depression, instead of binding them against the encroaching horror, seemed to be amplifying it, making them more vulnerable, more isolated within their own minds. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of Liam's bedroom wall. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the lodge's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the frantic tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing he had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing, almost magnetic pull. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses Chloe kept smelling, now sickly sweet and putrid. Chloe, unable to bear the laughter any longer, found herself drawn to the attic access panel in the ceiling of the hallway. The tapping was deafening here, a furious drumming. She could hear the distinct sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floorboards above, accompanied by a low, guttural groan. The giggling intensified, surrounding her, pressing in. She scrambled back, tripping over her own feet, collapsing in a heap on the floor. Sam, driven to the brink by the mocking whispers, started shouting at the empty air, his face contorted with rage and fear. He threw a whiskey bottle at the wall, shattering it, the crash echoing through the silent house. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" he screamed, his voice cracking. The whispers only grew louder, more numerous, a chorus of derision. Maya, desperate to find a logical explanation, stumbled into the lodge's small, dusty library. The books on the shelves seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. She pulled out an old, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. As she opened it, the symbols she'd seen drawn by the pen on her notes were scrawled across the first page, accompanied by archaic script. The air grew thick with ozone and the scent of decay. She began to read, her eyes widening in horror as she deciphered snippets. The sorrow feeds it, the despair strengthens it, a hunger for the broken. A piercing, unearthly shriek suddenly tore through the lodge, echoing from the attic. It was a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that ripped through their already frayed nerves. The tapping stopped, the giggling stopped, the whispers ceased. A profound, echoing silence descended, heavier and more terrifying than before. Then, from the attic access panel, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep, slowly, inexorably, dripping onto the hallway floor. It was thick, black, and smelled of decay and that metallic tang. And from the darkness of the attic opening, something began to descend. It was impossibly thin, a series of undulating segments that writhed and pulsed in the dim light. Its skin was slick and glistening, a sickly gray-green, covered in faint, almost imperceptible scales. It had no discernible head or limbs, just a long serpentine body that coiled and uncoiled, slowly, deliberately, filling the space of the hallway. And from its surface, hundreds of tiny, iridescent orbs dripped, falling onto the dusty floor with soft, wet plinks, each one pulsing with a faint, hypnotic glow. This was the source. This was the provider Maya had just read about, the entity that fed on their despair. As the creature, or whatever it was, continued to emerge, the air grew thick with that cloying, sweet scent, mixed now with something truly vile, like stagnant water and rotting meat. The cold intensified, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very life from them. The creature paused, its segmented body filling the entire hallway, its presence overwhelming. And then, from somewhere within its undulating mass, a single black, unblinking eye slowly opened. It was vast and ancient, reflecting the dim light, and it fixed on the four friends with an intelligence that was chillingly profound, utterly devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient predatory hunger. A voice, not heard with their ears but impressed directly into their minds, echoed in their skulls, a chorus of cold, ancient whispers. You crave, I provide. You consume, I grow. Your sorrow is my feast. Your despair, my sustenance. Liam stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping his lips. Chloe let out a whimpering sob, her forced cheer utterly shattered. Sam stared, his cynicism replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Maya dropped the journal, its brittle pages scattering, her academic mind reeling from the impossible, horrifying truth. The orbs on the floor pulsed, beckoning, but the sight of the creature, its vast, unblinking eye, and the chilling realization of its true nature, filled them with a horror that transcended even their deepest depression. This wasn't just a fix. It was a pact. They were its sustenance. The creature's segments began to twitch, and a single, long, translucent tendril uncoiled from its mass, reaching towards them. It moved slowly, deliberately, its tip dripping with the iridescent liquid. The despair in their guts screamed for it, but their minds recoiled. Run! Liam screamed, his voice raw, finally breaking free of his paralysis. They turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, a desperate primal flight. They scrambled through the living room, past the shrouded furniture, their feet slipping on the dusty floorboards. The lodge seemed to come alive around them, the shadows stretching, reaching, the cold intensifying, the scent of decay overwhelming. The walls groaned, the floorboards buckled, as if the entire structure was trying to swallow them whole. They reached the front door, their hands fumbling with the ancient lock, their fingers numb with terror. The creature's slithering was closer now, the scraping of its scales against the floorboards growing louder, a relentless pursuit. They could feel its presence behind them, the oppressive weight of its ancient hunger. With a desperate cry, Sam wrenched the door open, snapping the old lock, and they burst out into the night. The cool, damp air hit them like a shock, washing over their sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of the lodge. They didn't look back. They just ran, blindly, through the overgrown yard, past the skeletal trees, towards the faint, distant lights of Blackwood Peaks. They could hear the creature's low chuckle fading behind them, a promise of its patience, its endless wait. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed on the side of the winding mountain road, gasping for air, tears streaming down their faces. The despair still clung to them, a familiar weight, but it was now laced with a new, terrifying knowledge. They had seen the face of their own darkness, and it had been hungry. They eventually found their way back to civilization, a small, lost group, their eyes haunted, their bodies emaciated. They tried to explain, to warn, but their words came out as choked sobs, incoherent babbling. No one believed them. They were just four depressed friends who had gone on a disastrous retreat. They never returned to the Blackwood Peaks. They abandoned all their belongings, their cars, their past lives within those walls. The cheap lodge had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. Months later, scattered across different cities, the nightmares still came. The tapping, the giggling, the whispers, the slithering, the black eye, but something had changed. The shared trauma, the sheer, undeniable horror they had faced together, had forged a new, fragile connection between them. They talked now, truly talked, about the lodge, about their despair, about the unspeakable thing that had fed on their sorrow. The shared secret was a bond, a dark anchor that paradoxically pulled them closer, a testament to their survival. Their depression wasn't cured, not entirely. The scars ran deep, etched into their very beings. But they faced it together now, no longer isolated islands of sorrow. Sometimes, when the night was utterly silent, Liam would still feel a lingering chill. Chloe would hear a faint, reedy chuckle. Sam would swear he heard his own mocking voice, and Maya would see faint, swirling symbols in the patterns of condensation on a window. And they knew, with a chilling certainty, that the old hunting lodge wasn't just an old building. It was a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And they were just 4 more offerings in its long, hungry history, forever marked by the night they escaped its insidious embrace. They were survivors, but they were also a testament to the insatiable hunger that lurked in the shadows, a hunger that had almost consumed them whole. They had escaped, yes, but they carried a piece of the lodge, and its despair, within them, a constant, chilling reminder of the darkness that had almost claimed them. The rain lashed against the windows of the old Victorian house, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of Arthur's heart. He sat in his motorized wheelchair, a prisoner in his own living room, the power outage rendering his usual escape routes, the television, the internet, even the electric kettle, useless. He traced the smooth, cold metal of his joystick with a thumb, a futile gesture. Without power, the chair was a fancy, oversized paperweight. Arthur, a man in his late 40s, had been a paraplegic since a car accident in his 20s. He'd built a life for himself, adapted his home, and cultivated a fierce independence. But nights like this, when the world outside turned into a howling void and his carefully constructed sense of control crumbled, a primal fear gnawed at him. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder split the air, rattling the very foundations of the house. The emergency battery light on his wheelchair flickered, then died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Arthur let out a choked gasp. He was blind. Not literally, of course, but without the dim glow of the power indicator, the familiar contours of his living room vanished, replaced by an oppressive, inky blackness. He fumbled for his phone, a small, cold comfort in his shaking hand. No signal, of course. The storm had likely knocked out the cell towers. He was truly alone. The house, usually a haven, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the old timbers, every drip of water through a leaky gutter, was amplified, distorted into something sinister. He remembered the stories, the local legends whispered by the neighborhood kids. Old Mr. Abernathy, who'd lived in this house before him, had supposedly gone mad in his final years, convinced the house was alive, that it watched him. Arthur had always scoffed at such tales, but now, in the suffocating darkness, a chill snaked up his spine that had nothing to do with the failing furnace. He strained his ears, listening over the roar of the rain. Was that a whisper? He held his breath, the only sound the frantic thumping of his own pulse in his ears. Nothing, just the storm. He tried to rationalize, to remind himself that he was a sensible man, that fear was an irrational response to a simple power cut. But the rational part of his brain was shrinking, overshadowed by something far more primitive. Then he heard it again, a distinct scratching sound, coming from the wall behind the antique grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't the skittering of mice. This was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like fingernails dragging across plaster. Arthur's breath hitched. He knew that wall, It was solid, no access panels, no pipes that could cause such a noise. He swallowed, his throat suddenly parched. "Hello?" He croaked, his voice thin and reedy in the vast darkness. The scratching stopped. A long, agonizing silence followed, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Arthur's hands, clammy with sweat, tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. He wanted to move, to roll away from the sound, but he was pinned. His chair was useless. Then a new sound, a low, guttural groan, emanating from somewhere above him. The second floor, his bedroom, perhaps. His mind raced, desperately trying to conjure a logical explanation. The old house settling, a tree branch scraping against the roof, but the sound was too human, too filled with a profound, desolate sorrow. He remembered a fleeting thought he'd had when he first bought the house. The previous owner, Mr. Abernathy, had died in his sleep in the very bed that was now Arthur's. Had his spirit lingered? Arthur scoffed again, a nervous, humorless sound. He didn't believe in ghosts, but what if he was wrong? A faint, sickly sweet odor began to permeate the air, overriding the usual mustiness of the old house. It was a cloying, unsettling smell, like overripe flowers and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Arthur's stomach lurched. He heard the thump-thump-thump then, slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the main staircase. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He strained his eyes, trying to pierce the oppressive darkness, to see something. But there was nothing, only the absolute blackness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The footsteps paused on the bottom step, just outside the living room. Arthur could almost feel a presence there, a cold, heavy weight in the air. He could hear ragged, shallow breathing closer now, accompanied by a faint, wet gurgle. "Who's there?" Arthur demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound brave. No answer. Only the breathing, the gurgling, and the relentless drumming of the rain. Then a new sound, the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of liquid hitting the wooden floor. Arthur's imagination, already running wild, conjured grotesque images. Blood, or something worse. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. He heard a soft sigh, a sound of immense weariness. Then the footsteps began again, slowly, deliberately entering the living room. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, as if by doing so, he could make whatever was there disappear. But the sound of the approaching footsteps grew louder, closer. He could almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. A cold, clammy touch brushed against his cheek. Arthur yelped, a strangled sound of pure terror. He recoiled, trying to push himself back, but his useless legs refused to respond. He was utterly helpless. The touch lingered, a feather-light caress that felt strangely curious. Then it moved, tracing the line of his jaw, his chin, his neck. He could feel something else now, a faint, foul breath on his face, sickly sweet and reeking of decay. He opened his eyes, staring into the impenetrable blackness. He could feel the presence leaning over him, closer now, so close he could almost hear a faint, hissing sound. A single, elongated finger, cold and dry as old bone, touched his lips. Felt brittle, fragile, yet strangely strong. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't scream, couldn't even whimper. The finger moved, sliding over his mouth, then resting lightly on his Adam's apple. He could feel the faint tremor in the finger, a strange, almost human tremor. Then, a voice, a mere whisper, yet it resonated with an ancient, profound sadness. It was like wind chimes made of cracked glass, barely audible over the storm. Lonely, so lonely, Arthur's mind reeled. The voice was so close, so intimately close. He felt something else now, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth against his forehead, as if the unseen presence was leaning in, examining him. "You stay," the voice whispered again, a faint breath against his ear. "Forever." A new sound then, a rasping, tearing noise, like cloth being ripped, coming from the direction of his armrest. Arthur flinched, pulling his arm back as much as he could. He felt a sharp, stinging pain on his forearm, a cold, wet sensation. He gasped, his breath ragged. He wanted to cry out, to yell for help, but no sound would escape his throat. The scratching returned, more intense now, coming from all directions. The walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards beneath him seemed to be alive with a multitude of unseen claws. The air grew colder, heavy with the sickly sweet odor. He felt the presence move away from him. Then he heard the slow, dragging footsteps again, moving back towards the staircase. The drip, drip, drip resumed, fainter now, receding with the footsteps. Arthur lay there, paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. He could hear the footsteps ascend the stairs, slow and deliberate, until they faded into the general cacophony of the storm. The scratching continued, a symphony of unseen claws, now accompanied by a faint, mournful humming sound, coming from the upper floor. It was a tuneless, sorrowful sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. He didn't know how long he lay there, trembling in the dark. Time seemed to lose all meaning. His mind, still reeling from the encounter, tried to make sense of it, to find a rational explanation. But there was none. He touched his forearm, where he'd felt the stinging pain. His fingers came away wet and sticky. He brought them to his nose. The sickly, sweet, metallic scent was undeniable. Blood, his blood. A new wave of nausea washed over him. He was truly alone, at the mercy of whatever was in the house with him. He heard a faint creak from the hallway. He tensed, his body rigid with fear. Was it coming back? No, the sound was different this time, less deliberate. He heard another creak, then a faint thud, like something had fallen. He strained his ears. Silence, just the rain. Then, miraculously, a faint flicker of light. The emergency light on his wheelchair. Pulsed weakly at first, then held steady. The power was back on. A wave of relief, so potent it made him dizzy, washed over him. He could move. He could escape. He fumbled with the joystick, his hands still shaking. The chair hummed to life, a blessed mechanical whir. He turned, the faint light from the wheelchair's display casting long, dancing shadows across the room. His gaze fell upon the grandfather clock. Behind it, on the wall where he'd heard the scratching, a dark, viscous stain marred the floral wallpaper. It was a crude, distorted symbol, drawn in something dark and glistening, and beside it, scrawled into the plaster, as if with a sharp, pointed object, a single word, meaning. Arthur swallowed, his stomach churning. He quickly spun his chair around, heading for the front door. He just needed to get out. As he reached the entrance to the living room, his eyes fell upon the bottom step of the staircase. There, lying on the worn wooden floor, was a small, ornate silver locket. It was open, and inside, a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman with a strangely familiar, melancholic gaze. He didn't remember seeing it before. He was sure he hadn't. And then, he noticed something else. A faint, almost invisible trail of damp, reddish-brown drops leading from the locket, across the floor, and disappearing up the stairs. The drip, drip, drip he had heard earlier. He looked at his arm again. The cut was still there, but it wasn't deep, just a scratch. He hadn't felt anything sharp. He looked back at the locket, then up the dark, silent staircase. The humming, the scratching, the whispers, a sudden, horrifying realization dawned on him. The touch on his face, the finger on his lips, the breath. It hadn't been malicious. It had been curious. And the voice, it had been lonely. The scratching on the wall, the groan from upstairs, the drip, drip, drip of liquid. It wasn't a monstrous entity. It was something lost, something trapped. And the cut on his arm. What if it wasn't a wound inflicted by a monster, but a desperate plea for connection? He looked at the words scrawled on the wall, mine. Not as in possession, but as in kinship. He rolled his wheelchair to the front door, his hand hovering over the lock. The rain was still falling, but the thunder had subsided. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim, reassuring glow through the windows. He could leave. He could call for help. But as he looked back at the locket on the floor, at the dark stain on the wall, at the silent, imposing staircase leading to the unknown, a different kind of fear, a colder, more profound one, settled over him. What if he left and it followed him? What if it needed him? What if he was the only one who could truly understand its loneliness? He slowly, deliberately, pulled his hand away from the lock. He spun his wheelchair around, facing the staircase. He had spent his life adapting, finding ways to live with his limitations. Now, perhaps he had to adapt to something else entirely. Something unseen, unheard, yet undeniably present. The house was still dark upstairs, but the faint glow of his wheelchair's light seemed to reach up, beckoning. He took a deep breath, the lingering scent of decay and sweet flowers still in the air. He pushed the joystick forward. The motorized wheelchair hummed, and slowly, resolutely, Arthur began to ascend the stairs, towards the unseen presence that had whispered its desperate loneliness in the dark. He was no longer a prisoner of his home, but perhaps a reluctant companion in a chilling, shared solitude. The cold had been the first thing, not the biting, outdoor kind, but a subtle, pervasive chill that seeped into my bones the moment I stepped across the threshold of the old Victorian. I, Alara Vance, a newly minted librarian escaping the suffocating familiarity of my hometown, had thought it a quaint detail, part of the charm of a house built in 1890. The ad had called it historic character. I called it drafty but affordable. It stood isolated on the outskirts of Blackwood Creek, a town so small its main street was barely a block long, shadowed by ancient, gnarled oaks. The rent was impossibly low, a sweet siren song for someone like me, drowning in student debt. I'd ignored the whispers from the town locals, the averted gazes, the sudden silences when the house was mentioned. I was a practical woman, not one for superstitions. My first few weeks were a blur of boxes, dust, and the strangely persistent scent of dried roses and something vaguely metallic. I spent my days arranging my meager belongings, my evenings reading by the glow of a single lamp, trying to ignore the way the shadows danced in the periphery of my vision. The house felt vast and empty, its high ceilings and long hallways echoing with every movement. Then came the sounds, not the settling creaks of an old house, which I'd grown to expect, but something more deliberate. A faint, rhythmic tapping would begin each night around midnight, originating from the sealed-off attic above my bedroom. It was soft, hesitant at first, like a child's fingers drumming on wood, then growing firmer, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It would go on for hours, a maddening, persistent rhythm that drilled into my skull. I tried to rationalize it away. Branches against the roof, but the attic was directly above my bed, and there were no trees that close. Loose pipes? The tapping had a dry, woody resonance. I'd pound on the ceiling with a broom handle, yelling, "Stop it!" My voice, thin and reedy, would vanish into the cavernous space, leaving only the relentless tapping as an answer. Sometimes the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, accompanied by a faint, almost inaudible whimper, like a child crying from a great distance, choked and desperate. I'd press my ear against the cold plaster, straining to hear, but the moment I focused, the whimper would invariably fade, leaving me in the oppressive, damp silence of my room. Sleep became a luxury, stolen in fitful, restless bursts, punctuated by the phantom rhythm. One particularly damp evening, a storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The tapping intensified, frantic now, as if whatever was making the noise was desperately trying to get out. I huddled under my thickest duvet, the sound of physical presence in the room. Then, distinctly over the drumming rain and the tapping, came a soft, almost amused giggle. It was thin, reedy, undeniably human, yet utterly devoid of warmth or joy. It was the sound of something old laughing, something that had seen too much. It seemed to come from the very air around me, a chilling, insidious mirth. My blood ran cold. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't an animal. This was something else. I scrambled out of bed, pulling my blanket with me, my eyes wide and unblinking in the pre-dawn gloom. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the furthest corner of my living room, the faint glow of my phone a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak a stealthy footstep. The next day, driven by a desperate need for answers, I confronted Mrs. Gable, the town's oldest resident and keeper of the local archives, a woman whose eyes held the weary wisdom of generations. She was pruning roses in her overgrown garden, her movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Gable," I began, trying to sound calm. "I've been hearing strange noises in my new house, tapping and voices." She paused, her shears clanking softly against a thorny branch, her eyes, pale and sharp, fixed on mine. A long, drawn-out sigh escaped her lips, smelling faintly of lavender and damp earth. "Noises, dear?" she rasped, her voice like rustling leaves. "That house, it has always been prone to noises, especially at night." She looked back at her roses, but her body language was stiff, guarded. "You hear voices?" The way she pronounced the word sent a chill down my spine, her tone shifting, laced with a strange, knowing sorrow. "Just a whisper, maybe a giggle," I stammered, feeling foolish as the words left my mouth. A flicker of something, recognition, pity, fear, crossed her weathered face, gone as quickly as it appeared. She snipped another rose, its thorny stem snapping. "Don't pay it mind, child," she finally said, her voice dismissive, but her eyes held a strange, distant glint, as if looking at something far beyond the present. "Some houses, they just hold on to things. Best leave them be." The conversation was clearly over. Her denial, though subtle, was too quick, too absolute. Confirmed my fears, rather than alleviated them. That night, the activity escalated. The tapping became bolder, more complex, tracing intricate patterns that sounded eerily like letters being carved into the plaster of my bedroom wall. I pressed my ear to the cold, damp plaster again, trembling, and heard what sounded like faint, guttural chanting coming from deep within the house's infrastructure. A low, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a dark counterpoint to the tapping. It was primal, ancient, like nothing I had ever heard, resonating with a disturbing resonance. And that clinging, damp cold intensified, bringing with it a new, disturbing scent. The faint, unmistakable smell of decay, like damp earth and something long dead, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of those phantom roses. I couldn't stay in my apartment, not another minute. Every shadow felt alive, every creak a stealthy step towards me. Grabbing my keys and phone, I fled into the dimly lit hallway, the faint glow of emergency lights doing little to dispel the gloom. The hallway itself felt different. The air was heavier, colder, the scent of decay stronger here, clinging to the peeling wallpaper and the frayed edges of the once grand runner. The light from my phone seemed to struggle against the oppressive darkness, barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and stained carpet. As I walked, my bare footsteps echoing unnaturally loud, I noticed something new. On the wall opposite my apartment door, etched faintly into the peeling paint, were a series of symbols. They were crude, yet unmistakable, swirling, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and flow. My blood ran cold, a wave of nausea washing over me. This wasn't just my apartment. This wasn't just an old house. This was connected, part of something larger, darker, and infinitely more sinister. I hurried down the 3 flights of stairs to the ground floor, my heart pounding a frantic drum against my ribs. The chanting grew louder with each descending step, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied chorus that pressed against my eardrums. The stairwell was a vortex of cold, dank air, each breath feeling heavy and thick. As I reached the ground floor, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The main parlor, usually a dusty, and used room was now bathed in an eerie, pulsing red light. It flickered erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the walls, making the antique furniture seem to writhe and contort. And then I saw the source. The ancient, heavy wooden door to the house's cellar was ajar, a sliver of the pulsing red light escaping from within. From that gaping darkness, the smell of decay was overpowering, thick and cloying, making me gag. And the chanting, now a deafening crescendo, was clearly coming from below. It wasn't just chanting anymore. It was a frantic, desperate chorus of voices, layered on top of each other, speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Yet its tone was unmistakably one of supplication and terror, a chorus of pleading and agony. My legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. Every rational fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run out the front door, to never look back, to flee Blackwood Creek and never utter its name again. But the sight of those symbols, the chilling implication that this wasn't just my house, but part of a larger, darker tapestry, held me captive. The librarian in me, the part that sought knowledge, however dangerous, compelled me forward. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly, hesitantly, I pushed the cellar door open further. The red light pulsed more intensely, bathing the descending steps in a hellish glow. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing liquid, a suffocating mixture of decay, ozone, and something else. Something distinctly metallic, like rust and old, congealed blood. The chanting was deafening, a relentless assault on my sanity, twisting my thoughts, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. It clawed at the edges of my consciousness, threatening to pull me under. I began to descend the creaking, wooden stairs, each step a descent into an ever-deepening abyss of horror. The walls of the stairwell were slick with condensation, gleaming with an unnatural sheen in the pulsing red light. As I went deeper, the temperature plummeted, the chill so profound it felt like needles piercing my skin, the air so cold it burned my lungs. The scratching I had heard in my apartment seemed to echo from every direction, multiplied 1,000-fold, as if countless unseen entities were tearing at the very fabric of the house, trying to break free. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched into the impenetrable darkness. The pulsing red light spilled from a vast, open chamber at its end. I edged forward, my hands scraping against the rough, damp brick wall, the cold, gritty texture doing little to ground me. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, almost spongy, squishing faintly with each step. And then I saw them, faint, dark streaks on the floor, gleaming in the sporadic light, leading towards the red glow. They looked like drag marks, long, distinct trails, as if something heavy had been pulled through this darkness. The chanting in the chamber swelled, rising and falling in terrifying waves, a cacophony of agony and devotion. It was no longer just voices. There were other sounds mixed in. A wet, tearing noise like flesh being ripped, a soft, squelching sound like something being crushed underfoot, and then a low, guttural growl, deep and ancient, that vibrated through the very ground, a sound of immense, unfathomable hunger. I reached the entrance to the chamber and stopped, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes wide with disbelief and unspeakable terror. The room was immense, its true size obscured by the pulsing red light and shifting shadows that danced like tormented spirits. In the very center, on a raised, crudely constructed stone slab, was what looked like a massive, dark mass. It pulsed with the same unsettling rhythm as the red light, its surface glistening wetly, reflecting the infernal glow. From it, thin, almost translucent tendrils snaked outwards, disappearing into the impenetrable shadows, like roots seeking nourishment. And kneeling around the slab, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles that defied human anatomy, their faces obscured by the pulsing light and self-inflicted wounds that oozed dark liquid, were a dozen or so figures. They were chanting, their voices raw and desperate, their hands raised towards the pulsating mass, their movements jerky and spasmodic, like puppets on invisible strings. They were dressed in tattered, archaic clothing, the fabrics rotted and clinging, their skin pale and almost translucent, stretched taut over visible bone. As the red light pulsed, I saw fleeting glimpses of something utterly horrifying. Their eyes were not human. They were black, vacant pools, reflecting only the infernal glow, devoid of all life and sanity. And their mouths were stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, some stained dark. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a sickening miasma that coated my tongue and burned my lungs, mixed with the metallic tang of fresh, coppery blood and something else, something fetid and unholy, a stench of pure, concentrated evil. Strewn across the floor around the slab were discarded bones, dark, viscous stains, and scattered, personal effects. A tarnished locket, a child's worn shoe, a broken pair of spectacles, each item a silent testament to a life brutally ended, a life offered. One of the figures, thinner and more gaunt than the others, its hair a stringy, dark mess, suddenly rose. Its head snapped towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its neck had been broken and roughly reattached. It let out a piercing, unearthly shriek that ripped through the oppressive air, a sound of pure agony and malevolence, a sound that would forever haunt my nightmares. The other figures stopped their chanting, their heads slowly, synchronously turning towards me, their movements chillingly unified, their black, empty eyes fixed on me, a silent, predatory gaze that promised unspeakable torment, an ancient, boundless hunger. The pulsating mass on the slab seemed to throb faster, its tendrils quivering, elongating, reaching. My mind fractured. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. This was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and fear. My legs, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly found a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. I turned and ran, blindly, instinctively, back towards the stairs, the piercing shrieks of the figures echoing behind me, joined by the sickening sound of their bare feet pounding on the stone floor, gaining on me, a relentless, inhuman pursuit. I scrambled up the steps, 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the cold, damp air tearing at my throat, each breath a desperate fight for survival. The chanting resumed below me, now frantic, furious, a chorus of rage and dark purpose, mixed with the terrifying growl of the entity on the slab, a sound of immense, predatory satisfaction. The red light pulsed through the cracks in the door, painting the stairwell in shifting hues of hell, each flicker a glimpse into an abyss. I could feel their presence behind me, the cold, stale breath of death on my neck, their formless, hungry touch brushing against my skin, raising goosebumps of pure horror. I burst out into the dimly lit parlor, gasping, shaking uncontrollably, my body racked with a terror I had never known. The main front door of the old Victorian, the heavy, imposing oak door that usually required a key and a hefty shove, was now standing slightly ajar, a sliver of glorious, mundane street light peeking through the crack. It was an invitation, a promise of escape, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I threw myself against the door, pushing it open with a desperate surge of strength, scraping my hands raw against the splintered wood, and stumbled out onto the perpetually rain-slicked sidewalk. The cool night air hit me like a revelation, a cleansing wave washing over my sweat-soaked skin, carrying away the cloying scent of decay. The distant sounds of Blackwood Creek, the chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks, the faint, reassuring hum of the town's power lines, were a symphony of normalcy, a lifeline back to sanity. I didn't look back. I just ran, never stopping, never pausing, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement, until the crumbling brick facade of the old Victorian was a distant, horrifying memory, swallowed by the darkness behind me. I never returned to the old Victorian in Blackwood Creek. I abandoned all my belongings, my few pieces of furniture, my books, my entire life within those walls. The impossibly low rent had come at an unspeakable price, a price paid not in money, but in sanity. To this day, the faintest hint of metallic decay, the softest tapping sound, or the most innocuous red light sends a bolt of ice through my veins. Sometimes, when the night is utterly silent and the shadows lengthen in my new, mundane apartment miles away, I still hear the distant, reedy giggle or the ancient, guttural chanting, and I know with a chilling certainty that the old Victorian isn't just an old house. It's a living, breathing entity, a monstrous maw waiting to consume the unsuspecting. Its roots buried deep in something far older and far more terrifying than dust and forgotten secrets. And I was just one more offering in its long, hungry history. The cold, the sounds, the smell, they are all etched into my being, a permanent scar of the night I met the house's true residents. And sometimes, I wonder if the tapping ever stopped, or if it merely found a new surface to claim. The last rays of the setting sun, a bruised purple and fiery orange, painted the ancient rooftops of Bruges in a fleeting, deceptive beauty. The Vandervelde family, Thomas, the perpetually optimistic father, Clara, the pragmatic mother, and their two children, 10-year-old Lily and 14-year-old Finn, had spent the day enchanted by the city's canals and medieval architecture. Now, as twilight deepened, a chill seeped into the cobblestone streets, far colder than the autumn air. "Just a little further, kids," Thomas chirped, consulting his worn tourist map. "Our guest house is just past the belfry. We can grab some frites on the way." Lily, clutching her new lace doll, shivered. "It's getting dark, Papa, and quiet." Finn, usually absorbed in his phone, looked up, his brow furrowed. "She's right. Where is everyone? It was packed a few hours ago." Clara pulled her shawl tighter. "Perhaps the locals simply retreat indoors once the tourists disperse. Come on, let's hurry. I don't like the feel of this." The charming, bustling lanes of daylight Bruges had transformed into something else entirely. The gas lamps, when they flickered on, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch, making familiar archways appear like gaping maws. The gentle lapping of canal water against stone now sounded like a hungry whisper. And the silence, it was profound, unnerving, a silence that swallowed footsteps, muffled distant chimes, and left only the beating of their own hearts. As they hurried down a narrow, winding alley, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from ahead, a high-pitched, almost animalistic shriek quickly cut short. Thomas froze, his hand instinctively going to Clara's arm. "What was that?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide. Before Thomas could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the alley. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in what appeared to be old-fashioned, dark clothing that seemed to absorb the light. His face, though, was what seized their attention. It was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they burned with a cold, predatory hunger, a deep, unsettling crimson that pulsed faintly in the gloom. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too long, too sharp. "Run," Thomas breathed, his voice barely audible. "Run now." He shoved Clara and the children forward, turning to face the approaching figure, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man moved with impossible speed, a blur of dark cloth, closing the distance in a terrifying heartbeat. Thomas barely had time to raise his arm before a cold, crushing grip seized his wrist. He felt a searing pain, a burning cold that spread rapidly up his arm. The man's eyes, those terrible crimson orbs, fixed on his, and a low, guttural growl, like stones grinding together, vibrated through the air. "Go!" Thomas roared, wrenching his arm free with a desperate surge of adrenaline, stumbling backward. The man hissed, a sound like escaping steam, his gaze now locked onto the fleeing family. They ran, their footsteps echoing frantically on the cobblestones. Lily stumbled, her lace doll falling from her grasp, but Clara didn't dare stop. Finn, surprisingly agile, pulled his mother forward, his face pale with terror. They burst out of the alley into a wider square, dominated by the looming, dark silhouette of the belfry. The square, too, was deserted. The air here was colder, heavier, laden with a faint, metallic scent. Suddenly, From the shadows of a nearby archway, another figure emerged. Then another, and another. They were everywhere, materializing from the deepening gloom like wraiths, their pale faces and burning crimson eyes fixed on the family. They moved with a silent, unnatural grace, surrounding them, cutting off every escape route. "Papa!" Lily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Thomas, panting, spun around, his eyes darting from one terrifying figure to the next. There were at least a dozen of them, perhaps more, their numbers growing with each passing second. These were not mere men. These were the creatures of nightmare, the legends whispered in hushed tones. "Vampires! Stay together!" Clara cried, pulling the children close, her voice trembling but resolute. One of the vampires, a woman with long, dark hair that seemed to writhe like serpents in the dim light, glided forward. Her dress, though elegant, was stained with what looked like dried blood. Her smile was chillingly beautiful, a predatory invitation. "Such sweet, vibrant life," she purred, her voice like silk, yet laced with an ancient, terrible hunger. A rare treat in this quiet city. Thomas knew they couldn't fight them. They were outnumbered, outmatched. He had to buy them time. He looked around frantically, his gaze falling on a small, ornate church across the square, its wooden doors dark and imposing. "The church!" he yelled, pointing. "Run for the church! Now!" He grabbed a loose cobblestone, heavy and rough, and hurled it with all his might at the closest vampire. It struck the creature squarely in the chest with a dull thud. The vampire merely hissed, unfazed, its crimson eyes flaring with annoyance rather than pain. But it bought them a precious second. They sprinted across the square, Lily sobbing uncontrollably, Finn pushing his mother and sister forward with surprising strength. The vampires moved to intercept, their movements impossibly fast, flanking them, cutting them off. A tall, muscular vampire, its face scarred and ancient, lunged at Finn. Thomas, with a desperate burst of speed, threw himself in front of his son, taking the brunt of the attack. He felt a searing pain as the vampire's hand, cold and strong as iron, clamped onto his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling, but he held his ground, shielding Finn. "Go!" he gasped, his voice strained. "Don't look back." Clara, her face streaked with tears, hesitated for a split second, then pulled Lily and Finn forward, towards the church doors, leaving Thomas to face the horror alone. She knew with a terrible certainty that this was the only way. Thomas thrashed, trying to break free, but the vampire's grip was unbreakable. The creature leaned in, its breath cold and stale, its crimson eyes burning into his. He felt the sharp, agonizing prick of fangs at his neck, then a burning, sucking sensation as his life force began to drain away. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of agony and despair, as the world began to spin, his vision blurring. Clara, Lily, and Finn reached the heavy wooden doors of the church. Clara frantically tugged at the iron handle, but it was locked. Panic surged, cold and suffocating. "It's locked," she sobbed, pounding on the unforgiving wood. "Mama, look!" Lily cried, pointing. Through the gaps in the belfry's ancient stones, a pale, ethereal light began to glow. It was the moon, finally breaking through the clouds, a sliver of silver against the inky sky. And as its light touched the square, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer rippled through the air. The vampires, previously so confident, suddenly recoiled. A collective hiss of pain and frustration swept through their ranks. Their pale skin, touched by the moonlight, seemed to smoke faintly, and their crimson eyes narrowed, losing some of their terrifying intensity. "The moon!" Finn exclaimed, his voice hoarse. "They don't like the moonlight." The lead vampire, the woman with the silken voice, snarled, her beautiful face contorted in a mask of rage. "Fools! The night is still young. The shadows are long." But the brief exposure to the moonlight had given them a chance. Clara, seeing a small, ornate side door, yanked at its handle. It creaked open, revealing a dark, musty interior. "Inside! Quickly!" she urged, pushing the children through. They stumbled into the echoing darkness of the church, the scent of old incense and dust filling their nostrils. Clara slammed the heavy door shut, fumbling for a lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She found a rusty bolt and slid it home with a loud clang. Outside, they could hear the furious snarls and hisses of the vampires, their frustrated cries echoing against the ancient stone. The moonlight, though faint, seemed to hold them at bay, preventing them from approaching the hallowed ground. They huddled together in the darkness, trembling, listening to the sounds of their pursuers. The silence that followed was almost worse, a heavy, waiting silence, punctuated only by their ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of their hearts. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher, casting faint, silvery beams through the stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The sounds outside had ceased. "Are they gone?" Lily whispered, her voice tiny in the vast space. Clara didn't know. She felt a profound, aching emptiness where Thomas had been. He had sacrificed himself, bought them this chance. The thought was a raw wound in her soul. As dawn approached, a faint, gray light began to filter through the windows. The air in the church felt lighter, the oppressive dread slowly lifting. Clara cautiously unbolted the side door, peering out. The square was empty. The cobblestones gleamed wetly in the pre-dawn light. There was no sign of the vampires, no sign of Thomas. Only a faint, metallic stain on the cobblestones where he had fallen. They emerged from the church, blinking in the pale light, their bodies stiff with cold and fear. The city of Bruges, usually so picturesque, now seemed to hold a sinister secret, its beauty tainted by the night's horrors. They walked slowly, numbly, towards the city gates, avoiding the narrow alleys, sticking to the wider, more open streets. The first signs of morning life began to appear, a baker opening his shop, a milkman making his rounds. But to the Van der Velde family, the world felt irrevocably changed. As they reached the city outskirts, Lily suddenly stopped. She pointed to a small, dark stain on her lace doll, the one she had dropped in the alley. It was a faint, reddish-brown mark, almost imperceptible. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide. "My doll. It has a little bit of Papa's blood." Clara looked at the doll, then at Lily's innocent, yet strangely knowing face. A new, chilling thought took root in her mind. The vampires had recoiled from the moonlight, from the holy ground. But what about the blood, the essence of life now carried by their child? They left Bruges, never looking back. But the memory of the crimson eyes, the chilling whispers, and the ultimate sacrifice of Thomas would forever haunt them. And sometimes, in the dead of night, Clara would hear a faint, metallic hum, and she would look at Lily, sleeping peacefully, her lace doll clutched tight, and wonder what ancient hunger had truly been awakened, and what new, terrible legacy had been passed on in the heart of the silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying city of Bruges. The train car was a coffin on wheels, a suffocating metal box crammed with bodies pressed so close that breathing became a collective, desperate effort. Each gasp for air was a shared agony, each exhalation a cloud of fear and stale breath. Elias, a scholar whose life had once been defined by the quiet rustle of ancient texts, the scent of aged parchment, and the serene solitude of his study, now found his world reduced to the rhythmic, hypnotic clatter of the wheels on the tracks and the acrid, cloying stench of fear, unwashed humanity, and something else, something vaguely metallic like old blood. Each jolt of the carriage was a hammer blow against his dwindling hope, a physical manifestation of the relentless journey into the unknown. They were heading east, deeper into the heart of a continent consumed by madness, deeper into the maw of the war, a journey from which few returned. Whispers, thin and brittle as old paper, circulated through the cramped space, passed from trembling lip to trembling ear. Auschwitz, work camp, re-education, resettlement. No one dared speak the true, unspoken terror that lurked beneath those euphemisms, the chilling reality that gnawed at their collective consciousness. When the doors finally groaned open, a blast of frigid, biting air, thick with the smell of ash, human waste, and that same metallic tang, assaulted them. It was a physical blow, stealing their breath, stinging their eyes. The sky above was a perpetual, suffocating gray, a vast, oppressive blanket that pressed down on a landscape of stark, skeletal trees, endless rows of barbed wire fences, menacing watchtowers with their cold, unblinking eyes, and a sprawling, desolate expanse of barracks that stretched to the horizon. This was not a place of work, not a place of re-education. It was a place of systematic dehumanization, a factory of despair, designed to break the spirit before it broke the body. The first horror was the silence. Not the serene silence of peace or the comforting quiet of a library, but a heavy, unnatural quiet, a profound absence of human sound, broken only by the barked, guttural commands of the guards, the distant clang of metal on metal, and the shuffling, dragging cadence of thousands of defeated feet. It was the silence of suppressed screams, of unspoken agony, of souls slowly being extinguished, a silence that hummed with unshed tears and unvoiced prayers. Elias was stripped of his name, his clothes, his dignity. He became a number, a series of digits tattooed onto his forearm, a brand of ownership, a mark of his reduction from a man to an item. His days merged into an endless, monotonous cycle of grueling, senseless labor, meager, watery rations that barely sustained life, and the constant, gnawing fear of the unknown, the ever-present threat of arbitrary violence or sudden, inexplicable disappearance. The guards, with their impassive faces and their cold, dead eyes, were not human. They were extensions of the camp itself, instruments of its insidious will, devoid of empathy or mercy. Their boots crunched on the gravel, a sound that became synonymous with terror. But the true horror Elias soon discovered was not just the physical torment, the hunger, the cold, the beatings. It was the insidious, creeping dread that permeated every fiber of the camp, a psychological miasma that slowly, relentlessly eroded the mind, stripping away hope, reason, and eventually, identity itself. It was the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen, even in broad daylight, coiling around the barracks like hungry serpents, clinging to the watchtowers like grotesque gargoyles. It was the faint, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to drift on the wind, just at the edge of hearing. When no one was speaking, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to carry ancient secrets. He started noticing things, small at first, easily dismissed. The faces of the prisoners, already gaunt and hollow, seemed to subtly shift in the dim, flickering light of the barracks, their eyes sometimes reflecting a fleeting, unnatural gleam, a spark that was not of this world. The numbers tattooed on their arms, he swore, sometimes pulsed faintly, as if with an internal, malevolent energy, a silent, living brand. He dismissed it as exhaustion, as the slow unraveling of his own sanity in this hellish environment, a defense mechanism of a mind pushed to its breaking point. One night, huddled on his hard bunk, shivering despite the meager blanket, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They were not words, not yet, but a cacophony of dry rustles, faint clicks, and something that sounded uncannily like stifled laughter. A cruel, mocking sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the barracks, from the cold, damp earth beneath, from the very air itself. The air around him grew noticeably colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his very marrow, even with the feeble warmth of his own breath. He saw them then, in the deepest shadows of the barracks, at the periphery of his vision. Vague, humanoid forms, shimmering distortions in the air, barely perceptible, like heat haze on a summer road, but undeniably present. They were like the shadows themselves, but with a chilling sentience, a malevolent awareness. They moved silently, drifting between the sleeping forms, their presence radiating an ancient, malevolent cold that seeped into his very bones, a profound sense of despair and forgotten rage. These were the echoes, as the oldest prisoners whispered in hushed, terrified tones, their voices barely audible above the sounds of their own trembling. The remnants of those who had died here, not just physically, but spiritually. Their souls, trapped by the sheer weight of despair, by the unholy energy of the camp, by the countless atrocities committed within its fences, bound to this place, unable to find rest, condemned to an eternal torment. They were the silent witnesses, the eternal sufferers, and now something more. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its spectral wardens. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. The echoes were drawn to fear, to despair, to the raw, unfiltered agony of the living. They fed on it, growing stronger, more defined, their forms coalescing from mere distortions into almost solid apparitions. They were the camp's true inhabitants, its silent, unseen wardens, its malevolent heart. They were the ones who ensured no one truly escaped, not even in death, for death here was merely a transition to a different kind of imprisonment. Elias tried to rationalize it. Hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the mind's desperate attempt to cope with unimaginable horror, to create a tangible enemy in a world of intangible terror. But the cold was real, the whispers were real, and the growing sense of being watched, constantly, relentlessly, by unseen eyes, was terrifyingly, irrevocably real. The echoes began to interact, not physically, but subtly, insidiously. A prisoner might suddenly stumble, as if pushed by an unseen hand, falling into the mud or against a barbed wire fence. A meager ration of bread, clutched desperately, might vanish from a starving man's grasp, only to reappear, untouched, in a distant corner. A whispered secret, a desperate confession, might be repeated, chillingly accurately, by someone who couldn't possibly have heard it, their eyes wide with terror and confusion. They were the camp's unseen manipulators, its insidious puppet masters, pulling invisible strings, amplifying the suffering, orchestrating the despair. One night, a new prisoner, a young man named Samuel, arrived. He was defiant, his eyes still holding a spark of hope, a flicker of rebellion, a vibrant defiance that stood out starkly against the prevailing gloom. Elias saw the echoes gather around him, drawn to his vibrant, untainted spirit like moths to a flame, their forms shimmering with a renewed intensity. They whispered to him, unseen, unheard by others, weaving insidious doubts, planting seeds of despair, twisting his thoughts, eroding his will. Samuel's hope slowly withered, replaced by a profound, crushing hopelessness that settled over him like a shroud. Within a week, he was just another shuffling, hollow-eyed shell, his spark extinguished, his spirit broken, ready to join the silent ranks of the echoes. Elias understood then. The camp didn't just kill the body, it killed the soul. It was a spiritual charnel house, and the echoes were the instruments of that spiritual death, ensuring a fresh supply of tormented spirits to join their ranks, to swell their numbers, to perpetuate the cycle of despair. He realized he had to fight, not just for his physical life, which was fleeting, but for his very essence, for the integrity of his soul. He started to resist the despair, to cling to memories of sunlight, of laughter, of the scent of his books, of the warmth of his wife's hand in his. He would recite poetry in his mind, lines from Homer or Virgil, sing forgotten songs from his childhood, anything to create a flicker of light, a spark of life within himself that the echoes could not consume, a bastion against their encroaching darkness. The echoes hated it. Their whispers intensified, turning into a cacophony of dry, angry snarls, 1,000 discordant voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to shatter his resolve. They would press in on him, their cold presence suffocating, trying to crush his spirit, to force him to abandon hope. He would wake in the dead of night, feeling spectral hands on his throat, trying to choke the life out of him, not physically, but spiritually, trying to steal his breath, his will to live. One freezing morning, during roll call, as the biting wind whipped through the ranks of shivering prisoners, a guard singled out a frail, elderly man for punishment, his face contorted in a sneer. The guard's face was impassive, a mask of cold indifference, but Elias saw something else, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer around the guard, a subtle distortion in the air, a faint glow in his eyes. The echoes were influencing them, subtly guiding their cruelty, amplifying their malevolence, turning them into unwitting tools of their spiritual torment. The camp was a symbiotic horror, the living guards and the spectral echoes working in concert to break the prisoners, body and soul. Elias knew he couldn't escape the camp physically. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the armed guards, the sheer exhaustion, they were insurmountable barriers. But he could try to escape the echoes, to deny them his soul, to preserve his inner light. He began to share his memories, his stories, his fragments of hope with the few prisoners he trusted, those whose eyes still held a glimmer of something human. He would whisper tales of beauty, of love, of a world beyond the barbed wire, of art and music and freedom, trying to ignite a flicker of defiance in their own dying spirits, to remind them of what they were, what they had been. The echoes retaliated with renewed fury. The whispers became screams in his mind, 1,000 tormented voices trying to drown out his thoughts, to drive him mad. He would find himself inexplicably drawn to dangerous tasks, to places where the guards were most brutal, where the risk of death was highest. He knew they were trying to force him into a situation where his spirit would finally break, where he would succumb to despair and join them, another tortured soul in their eternal prison. One bitter evening, as the snow fell like ashes, coating the camp in a shroud of white, Elias was tasked with clearing a frozen ditch, the ice biting at his exposed skin. He was weak, shivering uncontrollably, his body screaming in protest with every movement. The echoes were all around him, their cold presence overwhelming, their whispers a deafening roar in his mind, a chorus of temptation and despair. Give up, Elias. Join us. There is no escape, only oblivion, only peace in the darkness. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, not physical, but an intense, crushing despair that threatened to consume him, to snuff out his last spark of life. He saw the faces of his loved ones, fading, blurring, as the echoes tried to erase them from his memory, to sever his last ties to life, to humanity. But then, a memory, sharp and vivid, cut through the haze of pain and despair. The scent of his wife's perfume, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the warmth of their embrace. A defiant spark ignited within him, a fierce, burning ember of hope, a refusal to yield. He would not give them that. He would not surrender his soul. He began to sing, a low, ragged murmur at first, barely audible above the wind, then growing stronger, a forgotten lullaby from his childhood, a melody of love and innocence. His voice was hoarse, broken, raw with emotion, but it was his voice, a sound of life, a defiant act of creation in a place of systematic destruction. The echoes recoiled, their whispers turned into pained shrieks, their forms flickering, dissolving like mist in the wind, unable to withstand the pure, unadulterated sound of life. The music, a vibrant pulse of life, a melody of human connection, was anathema to their spectral existence, a burning light against their shadow, a force they could not comprehend or endure. The guards, drawn by the strange, defiant sound, approached, their rifles raised. Elias continued to sing, his eyes fixed on the gray, oppressive sky, his voice a defiant beacon against the encroaching darkness. A guard raised his rifle, his face impassive, his finger tightening on the trigger. But as he looked at Elias, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, a momentary hesitation, a brief crack in the cold mask. The echo's influence, weakened by Elias's defiance, was momentarily broken, their hold over the living momentarily severed. The shot rang out, sharp and final, echoing across the frozen landscape. Elias fell, the cold earth rising to meet him, a final, brutal embrace. As his vision blurred, he saw the gray sky, and for a fleeting moment, a patch of brilliant, impossible blue, a glimpse of the world beyond the wire. He felt the cold embrace of death, but it was not the cold of the echoes. It was the cold of release, of peace, of freedom. His body lay in the snow, another number, another statistic in the camp's grim ledger. But his spirit, unbroken, soared. a defiant spark against the eternal gray. The echoes shrieked in frustration, their whispers turning into a chorus of impotent rage, their spectral forms writhing in torment. They had tried to claim him, but he had denied them. He had escaped their grasp, his soul untainted by their despair, a victory won in the face of absolute horror. The camp continued its grim work. More trains arrived, more numbers were tattooed, more souls were slowly extinguished. The echoes still lingered, drawn to the fear, feeding on the despair. Their whispers a constant, chilling presence, an eternal torment. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the barbed wire, carrying the scent of ash and despair, the oldest prisoners, those who had seen too much, those who clung to the last vestiges of hope, would swear they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible melody, a snippet of a lullaby carried on the wind, a sound that seemed to defy the very nature of the camp. It was a sound of defiance, a whisper of hope, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, even in a place designed to crush all spirit, some spirits could not be broken. And that even in a place designed to extinguish all life, some echoes fought back, not to torment, but to remind those who remained that true death was not of the body, but of the soul. And that, they knew, was a fate far more terrifying than the camp itself. The Serenity, a sleek, modern research vessel, cut through the sapphire waters of the Pacific. Dr. Eris Thorne, a marine biologist whose life was dedicated to the ocean's mysteries, stood on the deck, the salty spray a familiar kiss on his face. He inhaled deeply, the scent of salt and ozone a comforting balm. Below, his team prepared for their deep-sea expedition, a venture into the Mariana Trench, a place of crushing pressure and eternal darkness, where life was thought to be sparse, if not impossible. The sheer scale of the undertaking was daunting, a plunge into the last true frontier on Earth. Eris, however, harbored a different theory. He believed in the persistence of life, even in the most hostile environments. His current obsession was a series of anomalous sonic readings, faint but persistent, emanating from a previously uncharted section of the trench. They were too regular, too complex to be geological. They hinted at something alive, something that defied conventional understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. These readings, picked up by an experimental array of hydrophones deployed months prior, had become his waking thought and his restless dream. His team consisted of Dr. Lena Petrova, a brilliant but cautious oceanographer whose sharp intellect was often tempered by a healthy dose of skepticism; Ben Carter, the pragmatic and ever-joking submersible pilot whose easygoing demeanor belied a razor-sharp focus under pressure; and Maya Singh, the quiet, meticulous data analyst whose fingers danced across keyboards with an almost preternatural speed. The atmosphere on board was a mix of professional excitement and underlying apprehension, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of their conversations. The trench was unforgiving, a realm where even the slightest miscalculation could mean oblivion. Their submersible, the Triton, was a marvel of engineering, a sphere of reinforced titanium and composite alloys, designed to withstand pressures that would crush a battleship into a crumpled tin can. Its external lights alone consumed enough power to illuminate a small town. As they began their descent, the sunlight faded with startling rapidity, replaced by the Triton's powerful floodlights, which pierced the growing gloom with twin beams of artificial daylight. The ocean outside transformed, from vibrant blue to a deep, ominous indigo, then to an inky black, punctuated only by the sporadic, ethereal bioluminescent flashes of strange, deep-sea creatures, ghostly jellyfish, anglerfish with their lures like malevolent stars, and unseen forms that flitted just beyond the reach of their lights. The pressure gauges climbed steadily, each increment a stark reminder of the crushing forces building around them. The sonic readings intensified as they neared their target depth. They were rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but far too slow, too deep to be anything known. It was less a sound and more a vibration, a resonant thrum that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their chests. Lena adjusted the hydrophones, her brow furrowed in concentration, her usual caution replaced by a growing fascination. Eris, these aren't just sounds. They're patterns, like communication, and they're incredibly low frequency, almost infrasound. Something truly massive would be needed to generate this. Ben, ever the practical one, scoffed, trying to lighten the mood. Communication? Down here? From what? Giant squid playing charades. Or maybe the trench itself is just having a bad day. But even his joke held a tremor of unease. Eris, however, felt a thrill of anticipation that bordered on reverence. Perhaps something far older, Ben. Something that has adapted beyond our wildest imaginings. Something that has thrived in this darkness for millennia, evolving in ways we can barely conceive. He leaned closer to the sonar screen, his eyes gleaming. They reached the floor of the trench, a vast, desolate plain of volcanic rock, jagged fissures, and hydrothermal vents that spewed superheated, mineral-rich water into the frigid abyss. The Triton's lights revealed a landscape alien and stark, a silent, primordial world that had remained unchanged for millions of years. And then, Maya's voice, a hushed whisper that cut through the hum of the submersible systems, broke the profound silence. Movement, large, very large, directly ahead. And it's not a single echo. It's a complex, undulating mass. The sonar screen flared with a massive, elongated shape, far larger than any known marine creature. It was moving slowly, deliberately, towards them, its scale almost incomprehensible. The sheer size of the blip on the screen made their breath catch in their throats. Ben, full stop, Eris commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Lena, get a visual.
Max magnification.
Lena's fingers flew across the console, manipulating the external cameras. The image on the main screen flickered, then resolved into something that made their blood run cold, a sight that would forever haunt their nightmares. It was a shark, but not just any shark. This creature was immense, easily twice the size of a great white, perhaps even 3 times, its body a ghostly, pale gray, almost translucent in the submersible's lights. Its skin was ancient, scarred by untold battles with unseen horrors of the deep, covered in what looked like phosphorescent barnacles that pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, like a constellation of malevolent stars. Its eyes, however, were the most terrifying feature. They were not the dead, black, unseeing eyes of a typical shark, but large, intelligent orbs, glowing with an internal predatory light that seemed to pierce the Triton's hull and look directly into their souls. And its teeth, they were not merely rows of jagged points, but massive obsidian blades, some broken, others unnaturally long, like ancient daggers, each one capable of shearing through steel. "My God!" Lena breathed, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a megalodon? No, it's too big. And those eyes, they're aware." The creature circled them, its movements slow, deliberate, almost curious. It wasn't attacking, not yet. It was observing, assessing, like a colossal hunter studying its prey. The rhythmic thrumming, the heartbeat, seemed to emanate directly from it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the Triton's hull, a sound that seemed to bypass their ears and resonate within their very bones. "It's not just a shark," Eris whispered, a chilling realization dawning on him, a cold dread seeping into his veins. "It's evolved, adapted to this environment. It's using echolocation, but something more, something that allows it to perceive us, perhaps even our thoughts. It's reading us." Suddenly, the Triton shuddered. The shark had gently nudged them, a colossal, silent inquiry. The pressure outside was immense, and even a gentle touch from such a creature felt like a hammer blow, a warning. The submersible creaked in protest. "It's trying to communicate," Maya said, her voice barely audible, her fingers trembling as they hovered over her keyboard. "The patterns, they're becoming more complex. It's not just sound. It's a language, a very old language." Eris, driven by a desperate scientific curiosity that momentarily eclipsed his fear, activated the external microphone, attempting to broadcast a series of simple tones, a basic greeting. The shark responded instantly, its hum intensifying, the the patterns shifting, becoming more intricate, more demanding. It was a terrifying, exhilarating moment of first contact, a bridge across an unimaginable evolutionary chasm. But then the hum changed. It became agitated, sharper, filled with a deep, resonant growl that seemed to bypass their ears and vibrate directly in their bones. A sound of profound displeasure. The shark's glowing eyes narrowed, its massive body tensing, its movements no longer curious but menacing. "It's angry," Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What did you do, Eris? What did you say?" "I don't know," he stammered, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I just tried to respond, tried to acknowledge it." The Triton lurched violently as the shark slammed into them, not with a gentle nudge, but with the full, unbridled force of its immense body. Alarms blared, a cacophony of red lights and piercing sirens. Lights flickered, then died in sections of the submersible. Hull integrity compromised, Ben yelled, wrestling with the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "We're losing power to the main thrusters. Auxiliary power failing." The shark attacked again, its obsidian teeth scraping against the Triton's reinforced hull, producing a horrific screech that echoed inside the submersible, a sound of metal tearing and grinding. The creature wasn't just attacking. It seemed to be trying to pry them open, like a colossal predator cracking a nut, its intelligence focused on breaching their defenses. "It wants in," Maya whispered, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on the monstrous eye outside the viewport. "It wants us. It's not just curious. It's hunting." Eris's mind flashed back to the old workshop, to Elias Thorne's journal, and the hunger of the puppets for flesh and blood. This creature, this ancient leviathan, had the same hunger, but on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. It wasn't just a beast. It was an intelligence, an ancient, malevolent will that had survived in the crushing darkness, evolving to become the ultimate predator, a living embodiment of the abyss.
Ben, evasive maneuvers.
Anything, full reverse, divert all remaining power to the thrusters. Eris shouted, but the Triton was sluggish, hampered by the damage, its systems failing one by one. The shark hit them again, this time tearing away a section of the external plating near the stern. Water began to seep in, a thin, chilling stream that quickly became a steady trickle. The pressure outside was immense, and even a small breach was catastrophic. The submersible groaned, its metal shell groaning under the strain. "We have to ascend," Lena screamed, her voice bordering on hysteria, her hands pressed against the cold metal of the console. "Now, before it's too late." Ben fought the controls, his knuckles white, the Triton protesting with every movement. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to rise, the damaged thrusters struggling against the immense water resistance. But the shark was relentless. It followed, a pale, glowing phantom in the darkness, its hum a constant, terrifying presence, growing louder with every meter they ascended. It was faster than they expected, its massive tail propelling it with surprising speed, an impossible agility for a creature of its size. It struck again, this time at the Triton's primary propulsion system, the massive propellers at the rear. A sickening crunch, a sound of twisting metal and shattering components. The submersible lurched violently, then began to spin, tumbling uncontrollably through the black water. Lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the faint, eerie glow of the shark's eyes outside, which seemed to penetrate the very hull. "Emergency power," Eris yelled, fumbling for the backup controls, his fingers brushing against cold, unresponsive switches. A single, weak light flickered on, illuminating their terrified faces, casting long, dancing shadows. The hum was now deafening, a resonant vibration that filled the submersible, making their teeth ache, their very bones vibrate. The shark was right outside, its massive eye pressed against the viewport, staring in, an intelligent, ancient gaze that promised only oblivion. And then the hum changed again. It was no longer angry, but a low, resonant purr, a sound of deep satisfaction, of anticipation. And within it, Eris heard something else, something that wasn't sound, but a thought, a primal, ancient hunger that resonated directly in his mind, bypassing his ears, invading his consciousness. We have waited. We are hungry. We are the deep. And you are merely a taste of the surface. The Triton groaned, its metal hull protesting, the sound of tearing metal growing louder. A hairline crack appeared in the main viewport, spiderwebbing outwards with terrifying speed, a delicate, deadly pattern of impending doom. It's going to break through, Lena shrieked, pressing herself against the console, her eyes squeezed shut. We're going to be crushed. Ben, surprisingly calm in the face of absolute terror, grabbed a flare gun, his hand steady. If we're going down, he said, his voice grim, we're taking a piece of it with us. He aimed the flare gun at the glowing eye, a futile gesture against such a monstrous adversary. Eris knew it was futile. This creature was beyond flares, beyond human weapons, beyond any defense they could mount. It was a force of nature, an apex predator that had mastered the abyss, a being that had existed in the crushing darkness for eons, waiting for its moment. The crack widened, a jagged line across the viewport. Water began to spray in, a fine, cold mist that quickly turned into a torrent. The pressure was building, the submersible groaning like a dying beast, its internal structure beginning to buckle. The shark's hum intensified, filling their minds, drowning out their screams, their last, desperate breaths. It was a symphony of hunger, a song of the deep, a lullaby of annihilation. Eris felt his consciousness blurring, his thoughts becoming one with the resonant hum. He saw images in his mind. Vast, ancient oceans, countless eons of silent predation, the endless, crushing darkness. He saw other shapes, other glowing eyes, lurking in the abyss, waiting. Not just one, many, an entire lineage of these leviathans, slumbering in the unfathomable depths, awakened by their intrusion. The viewport shattered. The last thing Eris saw was the massive, glowing eye of the shark, inches from his face, and the gaping maw filled with obsidian blades, rushing towards him. The crushing pressure, the icy water, the primal hunger, it all consumed him in an instant, a final, terrifying embrace from the deep. The Serenity waited on the surface, its crew scanning the empty expanse of the Pacific. Days turned into weeks. The Triton was never found. The anomalous sonic readings from the Mariana Trench ceased, as if the very abyss had swallowed them whole. The ocean returned to its deceptive calm, its surface shimmering innocently under the sun. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden and the ocean was a vast, black mirror, sailors reported hearing it. A faint, deep hum, resonating from the depths. A sound that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten eons and an insatiable hunger. And sometimes, just sometimes, they saw it. A fleeting pale glow beneath the waves. A pair of intelligent predatory eyes, watching, waiting, for the next vessel to venture into the deep. The ocean, after all, held secrets far older and far more terrifying than humanity could ever comprehend. And some of those secrets, once awakened, never truly sleep. They only wait for the next meal, the next unsuspecting soul to fall into the deep's embrace. The old house stood on a forgotten lane, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy brows of overgrown eaves. For Elias Thorne, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, it was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where the dust of war could finally settle, where the screams of the past might fade into the quiet hum of rural life. He'd bought it cheap, a foreclosure, the previous owners having fled under circumstances whispered about in hushed tones by the few remaining locals. Something about the attic, they'd mumble, their eyes darting away. Elias, a man who had faced down far more tangible horrors, dismissed it as superstition. He was wrong. The first few weeks were peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of burning diesel and cordite that still sometimes clung to his nightmares. He spent his days repairing, painting, trying to infuse life back into the decaying structure. The house, despite its age, felt solid, a testament to old-world craftsmanship. But as dusk bled into night, a subtle shift occurred. The silence deepened, becoming less a comfort and more a presence. It began with the whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of dry leaves just beyond the threshold of hearing. Elias, accustomed to the phantom sounds of combat stress, initially ignored them. He'd clench his jaw, focus on the rhythmic creak of the floorboards as he walked, the gentle sigh of the wind through the ancient oaks outside. But the whispers persisted, coalescing into indistinct murmurs, sometimes sounding like a distant, desperate plea, other times like a low, guttural growl. Then came the cold. Not the chill of an autumn evening, but an unnatural, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from within the house itself. A frigid breath that snaked through the rooms, raising goosebumps on his arms even when the fire roared in the hearth. It was always strongest near the attic door, a heavy, unpainted slab of wood at the end of the upstairs hallway. He tried to open it once, early on, but it was jammed tight, as if sealed by an unseen force. He decided to leave it for later, a minor task in a long list of renovations. He now regretted that decision. One night, the whispers intensified. Elias lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows cast by the moon through the window dancing like specters on the plaster. The murmurs rose and fell, forming patterns, almost words. He strained to understand, his veteran's instincts screaming at him to identify the threat. And then he heard it clearly, a single agonizing sob that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the night. Came from the attic. He threw off his covers, his heart hammering against his ribs. Fear, a cold, unfamiliar dread, began to coil in his gut. This wasn't a flashback. This was real. He grabbed the old, heavy-duty flashlight he kept by his bedside, its beam cutting a stark path through the darkness as he moved towards the hallway. The attic door stood before him, a dark, malevolent rectangle. The cold emanating from it was palpable, a physical weight pressing against him. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and grasped the tarnished brass doorknob. This time it turned. Slowly, with a groan that echoed like a dying breath, the door swung inward, revealing a gaping maw of blackness, a wave of stale, musty air, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood washed over him. He shone the flashlight into the void. The beam was swallowed almost immediately, revealing nothing but deeper shadows. He took a hesitant step inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. Only the echo answered him. He moved deeper, the cold intensifying with every step. The attic was vast, a forgotten landscape of forgotten things. Dust-shrouded furniture, draped in white sheets like ghostly figures, loomed in the periphery of his light. Trunks overflowing with yellowed papers and brittle lace sat like forgotten tombs. And everywhere, the whispers. They were louder now, a cacophony of sorrow and rage, swirling around him, pressing in on him. He saw it then. In the center of the attic, bathed in the weak glow of his flashlight, stood a single antique rocking chair. It swayed gently back and forth, though there was no breeze. And in it, a figure. It was a woman, or what remained of one. Her form was translucent, shimmering like heat haze, yet undeniably present. Her hair, long and dark, cascaded over her shoulders, obscuring her face. She wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress, its fabric clinging to her spectral frame. As Elias watched, the rocking chair slowed, then stopped. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the woman's head began to lift. Elias felt a primal scream catch in his throat. Her face was a ruin. Eyes, hollow and black, stared out from sunken sockets. Her skin was a pallid gray, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. And her mouth was a gaping, silent scream, a void from which no sound could escape, yet from which the whispers seemed to emanate. She raised a hand, skeletal fingers pointing directly at him. The whispers coalesced, forming a single, chilling word, repeated over and over, clawing at his sanity. "Help me! Help me!" He stumbled backward, the flashlight beam wavering wildly. The woman's form flickered, then solidified, her eyes locking onto his. He felt a cold, crushing weight descend upon him, a sense of overwhelming despair that threatened to consume him. This was not a ghost he could fight with a rifle or a tactical maneuver. This was something ancient, something born of suffering, something that fed on fear. He turned and fled, scrambling down the attic stairs, the whispers chasing him, the woman's silent scream echoing in his mind. He slammed the attic door shut, fumbling with the lock, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, the cold still clinging to him like a shroud. For the next few days, Elias tried to rationalize it. Sleep deprivation, stress, the isolation of the old house. He was a veteran, a man of logic and training. Ghosts weren't real, but the cold remained, and the whispers, though fainter, still seeped under the attic door, a constant, insidious reminder. He started sleeping with the lights on, a loaded pistol under his pillow, a futile gesture against an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't touch. One evening, as he sat in the living room, trying to read, a faint scratching sound began. It came from the walls, a soft, rhythmic scrape, like something dragging its nails across plaster. He froze, his blood turning to ice. It started in the living room, moved to the dining room, then upstairs. It was circling him, a predator stalking its prey. He grabbed his pistol, his hands clammy. "Show yourself!" he roared, his voice cracking. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound. Then, a new sound, a faint, rhythmic thudding, like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from the attic. Elias's heart pounded. He knew what it was, the rocking chair. He couldn't stay. He had to leave. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his phone, and bolted for the front door. He fumbled with the lock, his fingers numb with terror. Finally, it clicked open. He burst out into the night, gasping for air, the cool night wind a balm on his fevered skin. He didn't look back. He just ran. Ran until his lungs burned and his legs ached. Ran until the old house was a distant, dark smudge against the horizon. He drove for hours, aimlessly. The image of the woman's ruined face burned into his mind. He ended up at a cheap motel, collapsing onto the bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, sent shivers down his spine. He knew he couldn't go back. The house, his sanctuary, had become his tomb. Days turned into weeks. Elias stayed in motels, then rented a small, nondescript apartment in a town far from the old house. He tried to rebuild his life, but the experience had shattered something within him. The nightmares were worse now, the faces of his fallen comrades mingling with the spectral image of the woman in the attic. He saw her in the shadows, heard her whispers in the wind. He started researching the house, digging through old town records, newspaper archives. He found mentions of the previous owners, a family named Miller, a mother, a father, and a young daughter. The articles were vague, hinting at a tragedy that had befallen them, a disappearance that had never been solved. The locals had been right to whisper. He found an old, faded photograph in a dusty historical society book. A family portrait, a smiling man, a gentle-looking woman, and a bright-eyed little girl. The woman's face, it was the same dark hair, the same delicate features, before they had been twisted into a mask of despair. Her name was Eleanor Miller. The more he learned, the more the pieces clicked into place, forming a horrifying mosaic. Eleanor had been a quiet woman, a talented seamstress. Her husband, a traveling salesman, was often away. The daughter, Lily, was sickly, confined to her bed for long periods. One day, Lily had simply vanished. The police had searched, but found no trace. Eleanor had become withdrawn, consumed by grief. Then, a few months later, Eleanor herself disappeared. The husband sold the house and left town, never to be seen again. Elias felt a cold dread settle over him. He understood now. The whispers, the cold, the silent scream. Eleanor was trapped in the attic, searching for her lost child. And he, Elias Thorne, the veteran who had sought peace, had stumbled into a nightmare far older and more profound than any war he had ever known. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to go back. Not to live there, but to help her. He was a soldier, and even against the supernatural, his training, his instinct to protect, to serve, kicked in. He had to find out what happened to Lily. He had to free Eleanor. He bought supplies. A stronger flashlight, a crowbar, a small, portable camera, and a voice recorder. He told no one of his intentions. This was his burden, his final mission. The drive back was agonizing. Every mile brought him closer to the suffocating dread of the house. He arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown yard. The house looked even more menacing than he remembered, a silent sentinel of sorrow. He pushed open the front door, the familiar groan echoing through the empty halls. The cold was immediate, a physical assault. The whispers were louder, more urgent, a chorus of anguish. He walked directly to the attic door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He gripped the crowbar, took a deep breath, and forced the door open. The rocking chair was swaying. Empty. He stepped inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the metallic sweetness of old blood. He started meticulously searching the attic, moving aside dust-shrouded furniture, opening old trunks. The camera recorded everything, the voice recorder capturing the escalating whispers. He found nothing at first, just the detritus of a forgotten life. Then, in a corner, behind a stack of old canvases, he saw it, a loose floorboard. He knelt, his hands trembling, and pried it open with the crowbar. Beneath the floorboard, wrapped in a faded, child-sized blanket, was a small, skeletal hand. Elias recoiled, a choked cry escaping his lips. Lily. She hadn't vanished. She had been here all along, murdered. As the realization dawned, the whispers in the attic exploded into a deafening shriek. The air grew impossibly cold, and the spectral form of Eleanor materialized before him. Her silent scream more potent, more agonizing than any sound he had ever heard. Her hollow eyes were fixed on the small, skeletal hand. Then, the rocking chair began to rock violently, faster and faster, until it seemed to blur. A new figure began to coalesce in the chair, a dark, malevolent presence, distinct from Eleanor. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that burned with a cold, hateful fire. Her husband, the traveling salesman. He was the monster. He had killed their daughter, and then, presumably, Eleanor herself, trapping her spirit in this house of horrors. The man's spectral form rose from the chair, a chilling snarl on his face. He lunged at Elias, a silent, furious attack. Elias reacted on instinct, swinging the crowbar. It passed harmlessly through the apparition, but the force of the swing, the sheer will behind it, seemed to disrupt the spectral form. The man recoiled, his form flickering. Eleanor, still shrieking silently, seemed to gain strength from Elias's action. She floated towards her husband, her translucent hands reaching out, not in supplication, but in a desperate, vengeful fury. The two spectral forms collided, a silent, swirling vortex of anguish and hatred. Elias, seeing his chance, acted quickly. He pulled out his phone, activated the camera, and aimed it at the skeletal remains of Lily. He spoke, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the spectral chaos. Eleanor, look, Lily, he killed her. He killed her. The words seemed to pierce through the veil. Eleanor's form solidified, her attention drawn to her child. The rage on her face intensified, but it was now directed solely at the malevolent figure of her husband. She let out another silent shriek, a sound that tore at Elias's very soul, and launched herself at the man. This time, her touch seemed to have an effect. The man screamed, a sound that was not silent, but a guttural, inhuman roar of pure agony. His form began to distort, to unravel, as if being torn apart by an unseen force. Eleanor, consumed by her righteous fury, continued her assault, her spectral hands tearing at him, pulling him apart. The attic filled with a blinding white light, and the screams of the man reached a crescendo, then abruptly cut off. The light intensified, then faded, taking both spectral forms with it. Silence, a profound, absolute silence descended upon the attic. The cold began to recede. The scent of decay dissipated. Elias stood there, panting, the crowbar still clutched in his hand. He looked down at the small, skeletal hand, then back at the empty space where the spirits had been. It was over. He carefully recovered Lily's remains, promising to give her a proper burial. He left the house for the last time, not running this time, but walking, a sense of profound exhaustion settling over him. He had faced his demons, both internal and external, and he had won. He arranged for Lily's burial in a quiet, sun-dappled cemetery, a small, unmarked grave. He never spoke of what he had seen, what he had done. The old house was sold, eventually torn down to make way for a new development. But sometimes, when the wind howled just right, or the shadows lengthened in the twilight, Elias Thorne would swear he could still hear it, a faint, distant whisper, no longer of anguish but of peace. And sometimes, just sometimes, he felt a lingering, grateful chill, a reminder of the echoes in the attic, and the quiet heroism of a veteran who finally found his peace by setting others free. The old Ashworth estate stood on a hill overlooking the town, a skeletal silhouette against the perpetually bruised twilight sky. Locals whispered tales of its former inhabitants, a family consumed by a madness that culminated in a fiery, unexplained end. For our group, Ethan, Chloe, Ben, and me, Sarah, it was the perfect stage for our most ambitious prank yet. We were notorious for our elaborate scares. Last Halloween, we convinced Ben his car was possessed by rigging the horn to blare randomly and the wipers to flail wildly. He nearly crashed into a mailbox. But tonight, we were targeting Ethan, the unflappable leader, the one who always scoffed at ghost stories. Our plan was simple. Convince him Ashworth Estate was truly haunted. You sure about this, guys? Chloe's voice was a nervous tremor, barely audible over the crunch of dead leaves under our boots. She clutched a flashlight, its beam dancing erratically. My grandma says people who go in there, they don't come out the same. Ben, ever the pragmatist, scoffed. Your grandma also thinks the mailman is a vampire, Chloe. It's an abandoned house. Creepy? Sure, but nothing a few strategically placed speakers and some fishing line can't handle. I adjusted the backpack containing our arsenal of scare tactics. A portable speaker loaded with blood-curdling screams, a fog machine, a remote-controlled toy spider, and a sheet for the classic ghost reveal. Relax, Chloe. It's just Ethan. He needs to be taken down a peg. Ethan, oblivious, was already at the crumbling front door, a mischievous grin on his face. All right, chickens, who's going first? Or should I just go in and clear out all the ghosts for you? He pushed the door open with a dramatic creak. A blast of stale, musty air, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, hit us. The darkness inside seemed to swallow the last vestiges of the setting sun. Okay, Ethan, you're the brave one, I said, trying to sound casual. You lead. We'll follow. He chuckled, stepping into the void. Piece of cake. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of our flashlights, illuminated by the occasional sliver of moonlight piercing through broken windows. Cobwebs draped from the high ceilings like morbid chandeliers. The air was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on us. Every floorboard groaned underfoot, every distant creak amplified in the silence. Our plan was to guide Ethan through the ground floor, setting off small scares, a sudden bang, a whispered voice, a fleeting shadow before the grand finale in the old ballroom. Ben was in charge of the sound effects from his phone, connected to the speaker. Chloe would handle the fog machine and the spider. I was the ghost. We moved deeper. The first scare was a success. Ben triggered a low, guttural growl from the speaker as Ethan passed a dark alcove. Ethan jumped, spun around, and then laughed. Very funny, Ben. You'll have to do better than that. Next, Chloe released the toy spider, sending it scuttling across the dusty floor towards Ethan's feet. He yelped, then kicked it, sending it skittering under a pile of rubble. All right, Chloe, you got me with the arachnophobia, but still amateur hour. His confidence was infuriating. We needed to step it up. We reached the ballroom. It was vast, with a collapsed ceiling in one corner revealing the skeletal ribs of the roof. Moonlight poured through the gaping hole, illuminating a grand, decaying staircase that spiraled upwards into impenetrable darkness. This was it. Okay, guys, positions, I whispered. Ben ducked behind a broken piano, ready with the sound effects. Chloe set up the fog machine near the far wall. I slipped behind a tattered curtain, pulling the white sheet over my head, ready to emerge when Ben gave the signal. Ethan stood in the center of the room, shining his flashlight around. So, this is the grand finale? Where's the big scary ghost? Ben pressed play. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the high walls. It was loud, piercing, designed to send shivers down your spine. But as it faded, something else happened. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that wasn't part of our recording. It felt like the very foundations of the house were vibrating with a deep, malevolent energy. Whoa, what was that? Ethan asked, his voice losing its bravado. Just the bass, Ben stammered, fumbling with his phone. Must be the old house amplifying it. Then the fog machine sputtered to life, but instead of a gentle mist, a thick, acrid cloud billowed out, smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic. It wasn't the sweet, artificial fog we were used to. It stung my eyes and made my throat itch. Chloe, what did you do? I hissed from behind the curtain. I didn't do anything, she choked, waving her hands in front of her face. It just went crazy. The hum intensified, and the air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. The moonlight streaming through the ceiling hole seemed to dim, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. This wasn't part of the prank. Suddenly, a floorboard directly behind Ethan creaked loudly. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the swirling fog. Nothing. All right, guys, this isn't funny anymore, Ethan said, his voice tight with genuine fear. Cut it out. But we hadn't done anything. Then, a whisper, clear as a bell, slithered through the air, right next to Ethan's ear. It wasn't Ben's voice. It was a dry, raspy sound, like sandpaper on bone. Get out, Ethan screamed, a real, terrified scream. He stumbled backward, tripping over something unseen, and fell to the floor, his flashlight clattering away and rolling into the shadows. Ethan! I yelled, throwing off the sheet. This was too far. This was real. The hum became a low thrum, vibrating through my teeth. The air was thick with the scent of decay. From the darkness at the top of the grand staircase, a faint, flickering light appeared. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a pale, phosphorescent glow, like foxfire, slowly descending. Run! Ben shrieked, scrambling out from behind the piano. We didn't need to be told twice. Chloe was already bolting for the front door, her panicked gasps echoing. Ethan, still on the floor, was trying to crawl away, his eyes wide with terror fixed on the descending light. I ran to him, grabbing his arm. Come on, Ethan. Get up. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. His eyes were fixed on the light, which was now halfway down the stairs. It wasn't just a light. It was coalescing, forming a vague, humanoid shape within its glow. It was tall, impossibly thin, and seemed to shimmer with an internal, malevolent energy. It's them, Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. The Ashworths. I dragged him, pulling him to his feet. We stumbled towards the front door, Chloe's terrified screams guiding us. But as we reached the entrance, the heavy oak door slammed shut with a thunderous boom that shook the entire house. Chloe cried out, pounding on the door. "It's locked! It's locked!" Panic, cold and sharp, seized my heart. We were trapped. The hum intensified, filling the house, pressing in on us. The air grew even colder, and the metallic, sweet scent became overpowering, making me gag. The phosphorescent figure was now at the bottom of the stairs, its form clearer, though still indistinct, like looking through rippling water. It was tall, gaunt, with long skeletal limbs that seemed to stretch and distort in the flickering light. 2 pinpricks of crimson glowed where its eyes should be. "We need to find another way out," Ben yelled, his voice cracking. He ran towards a window, but as his hand touched the glass, a spiderweb crack appeared, spreading rapidly across the pane. He recoiled as if burned. The figure began to glide towards us, not walking, but floating, its movements unnaturally smooth. The air around it shimmered. Upstairs. Ethan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the grand staircase. Maybe there's a back exit. It was a desperate gamble, but our only option. We scrambled up the decaying stairs, the wood groaning ominously under our weight. The phosphorescent figure followed, its silent ascent more terrifying than any footsteps. We reached the landing. Several doors branched off into the darkness. We chose one at random, bursting into what looked like an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with moldering tomes. A heavy, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, covered in dust. "This way." Ben pointed to another door at the back of the study. We rushed towards it, but as we reached it, the doorknob twisted violently from the inside, and the door slammed shut. A low, guttural laugh, dry and brittle, echoed from the shadows behind the desk. It wasn't the figure. It was something else, something unseen. What was that? Chloe whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. The phosphorescent figure appeared in the doorway we had just entered, blocking our escape, his crimson eyes fixed on us. "You came to play," the dry voice whispered, seeming to emanate from all around us, from the very walls of the house. "Now you stay." Suddenly, the books on the shelves began to fly off, hurtling towards us like projectiles. We ducked, shielding our heads. One hit Ben squarely in the temple. He cried out, stumbling backward and collapsing against the wall, a trickle of blood appearing on his forehead. "Ben!" I yelled, rushing to him. He was dazed, his eyes unfocused. The phosphorescent figure raised a skeletal arm, pointing a long, glowing finger at Ethan. The air around Ethan shimmered, and he let out a choked gasp, clutching his throat. His face turned purple, his hands scrabbling at his neck as if an invisible noose was tightening around him. "No!" I screamed, trying to reach him, but the air between us felt like a solid wall. Ethan's eyes bulged, his body convulsing. He fell to his knees, still gasping, and then, with a final, desperate wheeze, he went limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The phosphorescent figure lowered its arm. Ethan was dead. Chloe let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. She scrambled away from the figure, tearing at her hair. "No, not Ethan. Please, no." The dry, brittle laugh filled the room again. One down, 2 to go. The figure began to advance on Chloe. She backed away, stumbling over furniture, her eyes wide with terror. I was frozen, watching in horror, my mind unable to process what was happening. This wasn't a prank. This was real. Ethan was dead. "Chloe, run!" I finally managed to scream, my voice hoarse. She turned, blindly searching for an escape, and her eyes landed on a large, ornate grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Its pendulum swung slowly, silently. Without thinking, she darted towards it, trying to hide behind it. The phosphorescent figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. Chloe's scream was cut short, a gurgling sound. I saw a flash of glowing light, And then the figure was standing over the grandfather clock, its form shimmering. Chloe was gone, vanished. There was only a faint, lingering scent of ozone and blood. I was alone with Ben, who was still slumped against the wall, barely conscious. The figure turned its glowing crimson eyes on me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Couldn't fight. I was just a girl, armed with nothing but a useless flashlight and a backpack full of discarded prank props. The dry, brittle voice whispered directly into my mind, chilling me to the bone. You disturbed our rest. You mocked our pain. Now you will join us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. The cold intensified, pressing in on me, suffocating. I could feel the malevolent presence drawing closer, its icy touch already on my skin. But then, a faint sound broke through the oppressive silence. A distant siren. The phosphorescent figure paused. Its form flickered, becoming less distinct. The hum in the house began to recede, fading into a low drone. The cold lessened, replaced by the stale, musty air I had first encountered. They come, the dry voice hissed, filled with a sudden, chilling fury. But we will wait. You will return. And then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, the figure vanished. The room was plunged back into relative darkness, illuminated only by the weak beam of my flashlight, which had rolled to a stop near Ethan's still form. The sirens grew louder, closer. I stumbled towards Ben, shaking him. Ben, wake up. We have to go. He groaned, slowly opening his eyes. He looked at Ethan, then at the empty space where Chloe had been, and a fresh wave of horror washed over his face. Sarah, what happened? We have to get out of here, I whispered, pulling him to his feet. We stumbled out of the study, down the grand staircase, and to the front door. It was still closed, but the lock was gone, splintered wood around the frame. I pushed it open, and we burst out into the night, gasping for breath. The cold night air a welcome shock against my burning lungs. The flashing lights of police cars and an ambulance were visible at the end of the long, winding driveway. Someone must have heard Chloe's screams, or perhaps a neighbor had finally called about the commotion. We ran towards them, screaming, crying, incoherent with terror and grief. The police found Ethan's body inside. They found no trace of Chloe. They found no evidence of any figure or supernatural activity. They attributed Ethan's death to a sudden, fatal heart attack, likely brought on by extreme fright, and Chloe's disappearance to a panicked flight into the woods, where she presumably got lost. They searched for days, but Chloe was never found. Ben and I told our story, but no one believed us. How could they? It sounded like the ravings of two traumatized teenagers. We were questioned, examined, and eventually released, haunted by what we had witnessed. Ashworth Estate still stands, a silent sentinel on the hill. The locals still whisper about it, but now, when I hear those whispers, I know they are true. I see Ethan's lifeless eyes, Chloe's terrified face, and I hear that dry, brittle laugh echoing in the silence of my nightmares. We went to Ashworth Estate for a prank. We left with a chilling truth. Some places are best left undisturbed, and some silences should never be broken. Because sometimes when you play with fear, fear plays back. And it doesn't play fair. Timothy Sterling, a man whose name echoed with the clink of old money and the rustle of silk, lived in a mansion that was less a home and more a monument to his family's enduring wealth. Sterling Manor, a Gothic revival behemoth perched atop a windswept bluff overlooking the churning Atlantic, had seen generations of Sterlings come and go, each adding their layer of opulence and, perhaps, a whisper of their own particular madness. Tim, the latest inheritor of this grand, chilling legacy, found himself increasingly adrift within its cavernous halls. He was a man of precise habits and meticulous order. His days were a symphony of scheduled meetings, market analyses, and philanthropic gestures that served more to polish his public image than to genuinely aid the less fortunate. Yet, beneath this veneer of control, a subtle tremor had begun to ripple through his carefully constructed world. It started innocently enough. A misplaced antique, a faint, inexplicable chill in a usually warm room, the fleeting scent of something ancient and metallic, like old blood and rust, in the air. His staff, a retinue of discreet, long-serving individuals, noticed his growing unease. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose face was a roadmap of Sterling family secrets, would eye him with a knowing, almost pitying gaze. John, the stoic butler, moved with an even greater quietness, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that clung to the manor like a shroud. The catalyst for Tim's descent into genuine fear was the heirloom. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a grim-faced courier who spoke in clipped tones of unforeseen circumstances and final bequests. It was a box, intricately carved from what appeared to be obsidian, its surface cool and slick to the touch, absorbing all light. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single unadorned silver locket. It was tarnished with age, and when Tim prized it open, he found it empty. No faded photograph, no lock of hair, just a void. A note accompanied the box, written in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. To Timothy, the last of the line. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. There was no signature. Tim, a man of logic and reason, dismissed it as a morbid prank, perhaps from a distant, disgruntled relative. He placed the locket and the obsidian box on his study desk, intending to have John dispose of them later. But he didn't. Something about the box, its impenetrable darkness, its cold weight, compelled him. That night, the manor truly began to stir. He was awoken by a sound, subtle at first, like the whisper of silk across polished floors. He sat up in his vast, four-poster bed, his heart thrumming. The sound grew, becoming a distinct, rhythmic dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the marble tiles of the grand hall below. He reached for the ornate silver bell on his bedside table, intending to summon John, but his hand froze. The sound was coming from inside his room. A shadow, deeper than the moonless night outside, detached itself from the corner of his chamber. It was formless, yet possessed a palpable presence, a weight that pressed down on the air. A cold, metallic scent, stronger now, filled his nostrils. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His breath hitched in his throat. The shadow drifted towards his desk, towards the obsidian box. It hovered there for a moment, and then, with an almost imperceptible shift, it seemed to absorb the darkness of the box, making it even blacker, even more absolute. A faint, high-pitched keening sound, like wind through a tomb, emanated from the shadow. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it receded, melting back into the shadows of the room. The dragging sound faded. Tim was left trembling, bathed in a cold sweat, the metallic scent lingering like a phantom. The next morning, he found the locket open on his desk, its empty interior glinting faintly in the morning light. He was certain he had closed it. He tried to rationalize it. Sleep deprivation, stress, the old house playing tricks on him. But the metallic scent, the palpable cold, the feeling of an unseen presence, these were not figments of his imagination. He began to research. The Sterling family history was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, power, and a surprising number of unexplained disappearances and sudden, violent deaths. He delved into dusty archives in the manor's forgotten library, poring over brittle journals and faded letters. He discovered mentions of a Sterling curse, a whispered legend about a pact made by an ancestor, Elias Sterling, in the 17th century, a pact for immense wealth and influence at an unspeakable cost. The journal spoke of the Collector, a shadowy entity that Elias had supposedly bound to the family line. It was said to collect payments from each generation, not in gold or land, but in something far more precious. The journals became increasingly frantic, their authors descending into madness, their final entries scrawled in desperate, illegible script, hinting at a final reckoning. One journal, belonging to his great-great-grandfather, Alistair Sterling, contained a chilling passage. The The locket. It is the key. Not to open, but to contain. It must be filled. It must be fed. Tim felt a cold dread seep into his bones. What was to be fed? And with what? The manifestations grew bolder. Objects moved on their own. Doors slammed shut when no one was near. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. A fleeting shadow, a flicker of something dark and slender. The metallic scent was now omnipresent, clinging to the very fabric of the manor. One evening, as he sat in the study, the locket on his desk began to vibrate. A low hum filled the room, growing in intensity. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light. Then, from its empty interior, a faint, silvery mist began to curl outwards, coalescing into a spectral, skeletal hand. It reached out, its long, bony fingers trembling, as if searching for something. Tim scrambled back, overturning his chair. The hand retracted, and the mist dissipated, leaving the locket still and empty once more. He knew then that he couldn't ignore it. The heirloom was not a prank. It was a conduit, and the collector was not a legend. It was real. He confronted Mrs. Gable. Her face, usually so composed, paled when he mentioned the obsidian box and the locket. "It's the Sterling's bane, Mr. Timothy," she whispered, her voice raspy with fear. "My grandmother worked here, and her grandmother before her. They all knew. The collector comes for what's owed." "What's owed, Mrs. Gable?" Tim demanded, his voice tight. She wrung her hands. "Life, Mr. Timothy. Life. It feeds on the essence, the spirit. That's why the locket is empty. It's meant to be filled." The realization hit Tim with the force of a physical blow. The disappearances, the madness, the sudden deaths. The collector wasn't taking gold. It was taking souls, and the locket was its vessel. He understood the note now. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. The locket didn't open to reveal something. It opened to receive something. And what was locked away was the very essence of life, trapped within the Sterling line. Tim was a man of immense wealth, but suddenly he felt utterly impoverished. His money, his power, his influence, none of it could protect him from this ancient, insatiable hunger. He spent days and nights researching, growing gaunt, his eyes hollowed by lack of sleep. He found a cryptic passage in Alistair's journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the library. It detailed a ritual, a desperate attempt to appease the collector, to satiate its hunger with a substitute offering. Alistair had failed, driven mad by the attempt. But the ritual described a way to temporarily bind the entity, to force it back into its slumber. The ritual required a sacrifice, not a human one, Alistair had emphasized, but something of immense personal value, imbued with a powerful emotional connection. And it had to be offered at the precise moment of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The winter solstice was 3 days away. Tim looked around his opulent prison. What did he possess that held immense personal value? He had never truly loved anything but his own comfort and control. His wealth was a means, not an end. His possessions were status symbols, not cherished memories. Then he remembered. His grandfather, a man he had genuinely admired, had given him a small, unassuming pocket watch when he was a boy. It was not valuable in monetary terms, but it was the only thing he possessed that carried a true emotional weight, a connection to a simpler, happier time. It was the only thing that wasn't tainted by the Sterling legacy of greed and darkness. The manor became a battleground. The collector, sensing his intent, intensified its attacks. Whispers echoed from empty rooms, chilling him to the bone. Apparitions, fleeting and grotesque, flickered in the corners of his vision. He would wake to find himself paralyzed, a crushing weight on his chest, the metallic scent suffocating him. He saw shadows coalesce into figures, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, their mouths opening in silent screams. He barricaded himself in the library, the only room where he felt a semblance of safety, surrounded by the knowledge of his ancestors' folly. He meticulously prepared for the ritual, gathering the obscure herbs, the arcane symbols, the ancient incantations described in Alistair's journal. On the night of the solstice, a blizzard raged outside, mirroring the storm within Stirling Manor. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the ancient windows. The power flickered, plunging the manor into darkness, then restoring it with a jarring surge. Tim stood in the center of the library, the pocket watch clutched in his hand. The locket lay open on a makeshift altar, surrounded by flickering candles. The metallic scent was overwhelming, thick and cloying. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The shadow appeared, larger and more defined than ever before. It filled the room, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, its presence a suffocating weight. From its depths, two pinpricks of crimson light flared, like malevolent eyes. A voice, ancient and guttural, echoed in his mind, not heard with his ears, but felt in his very bones. "You seek to deny me what is mine, Stirling. The debt is due." Tim, despite his terror, stood firm. He began to chant the incantations, his voice trembling but resolute. The shadow recoiled slightly, a ripple passing through its form. He placed the pocket watch into the empty locket. As it settled, a blinding flash of light erupted from the locket, followed by a deafening shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The crimson eyes of the shadow widened, and it began to writhe, its form flickering. The locket glowed with an intense, pure light, pushing back the encroaching darkness. The metallic scent began to fade, replaced by the faint, comforting aroma of old wood and dust. The shadow, with one final, desperate lunge, tried to reclaim the locket. But the light held, a barrier of pure, unyielding energy. With a final, ear-splitting wail, the shadow was sucked back into the locket, which snapped shut with an audible click. The light faded. The metallic scent vanished. The storm outside began to subside. Tim stood there, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The locket lay on the altar, no longer glowing, no longer radiating cold. It was just a tarnished silver locket, now containing the pocket watch. He picked it up, felt warm, and for the first time, not ominous. The silence in the manor was profound, a blessed absence of the unseen horrors that had plagued him. He had won. He had broken the Stirling curse, or so he thought. Days turned into weeks. The manor felt different, lighter. The staff noticed it too. Mrs. Gable even smiled, a rare and genuine expression. Tim began to sleep soundly, the nightmares banished. He even started to consider selling the manor, starting anew. But then the dreams began. They were vivid, unsettling. He would find himself in a vast, empty void, the only sound the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock. And in the distance, a tiny crimson light would flicker, growing steadily brighter. He dismissed them as residual stress. But the dreams grew more intense, more real. He would wake up feeling drained, as if something had been siphoned from him during the night. One morning, he noticed a faint, metallic scent in his room, just a hint, almost imperceptible. He tried to ignore it. Then the locket. He had placed it in a locked safe deep within his study. But one morning, he found it on his bedside table, open, and the pocket watch was gone. His blood ran cold. He rushed to the safe. It was still locked, undisturbed. He checked his pockets, his drawers. The pocket watch was nowhere to be found. He remembered Alistair's journal. The key is not to open, but to understand what was locked away. And the collector's voice. "You seek to deny me what is mine." The collector hadn't been banished. It had been trapped. And the locket, the vessel, was now empty once more. The metallic scent grew stronger. The subtle chills returned. He began to hear the faint, rhythmic dragging sound again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the grand hall. It was coming from inside his own mind. He saw it then in the reflection of the antique mirror in his study. Not a shadow, not a formless void, but a faint, shimmering outline within his own reflection. It was a skeletal hand, reaching out from within him, its fingers twitching, its grasp tightening. The collector hadn't wanted the pocket watch. It had wanted the vessel to be empty. It had wanted the locket to be free to collect again. And what was the most valuable thing he possessed now? The thing imbued with the most powerful emotional connection. The thing he had used to break the curse. His own life. His own essence. The sterling curse wasn't about a debt to be paid. It was about a hunger that could never be truly satisfied. It was about a collector that, once bound, would always seek to fill its empty vessel, generation after generation, until there was nothing left. Timothy Sterling, the last of his line, looked into the mirror and saw the crimson pinpricks of light begin to flare in his own eyes. The metallic scent filled his lungs, and he felt a cold, crushing weight begin to settle over his heart. The ticking sound in his mind grew louder, faster, counting down the final moments of the Sterling legacy. The locket was empty, and it was waiting to be filled. Dimp was a creature of habit and of current. His life revolved around the hum of transformers, the crisp snap of circuit breakers, and the satisfying glow of a newly wired fixture. His real name was Archibald P. Dimpleton, but everyone, even his mother, called him Dimp. He was a man of meticulous order, his tools laid out in his van with surgical precision, his work boots always polished, his lunch packed with the same tuna sandwich and apple every day. He wasn't particularly social, preferring the silent, logical puzzles of faulty wiring to the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. His days were a predictable rhythm. Wake, coffee, work, dinner, sleep, repeat. Until the call came from Blackwood Manor. It was late on a Tuesday, the kind of twilight that bled from bruised purple to inky black, when his old flip phone, a relic he clung to with stubborn affection, buzzed. The caller ID was blocked. Dimp, usually wary of such calls, answered out of a strange, uncharacteristic impulse. "Dimp Electrical Services," he grunted, his voice raspy from a day spent tracing ancient knob and tube in a dusty attic. A voice, thin and reedy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, replied, "Mr. Dimpleton, my name is Elias Thorne. I require your unique expertise at Blackwood Manor. Urgent electrical issues. Very urgent." Dimp frowned. Blackwood Manor. The name alone was a local legend, whispered in hushed tones. An imposing Victorian monstrosity on the outskirts of town, visible only as a skeletal silhouette against the horizon, shrouded by ancient, gnarled oaks. It had been empty for decades, a monument to forgotten tragedies and whispered horrors. No one went near Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor? Dimp repeated, a tremor in his voice he immediately regretted. "That place has been condemned for years, Mr. Thorne. No power. It has peculiarities, Mr. Dimpleton, and it requires a very particular hand. A hand that understands the flow, the pulse of a building. I assure you the compensation will be substantial." The voice paused, and Dimp could almost hear a dry, rasping breath on the other end. "Tonight, if possible." Dimp hesitated, every fiber of his logical, risk-averse being screamed no. But the promise of substantial compensation and a prickle of professional curiosity about what kind of peculiarities could plague a condemned, long-abandoned house gnawed at him. He was an electrician, not a ghost hunter. Electrical problems had solutions. "All right," Dimp said, surprising himself. "Give me the address and directions." It's not exactly on the map. The directions were indeed convoluted, leading him down a winding, overgrown lane that seemed to swallow his headlights whole. The air grew colder, heavier, as he approached. The trees, ancient and skeletal, clawed at the bruised sky. Then, through a gap in the foliage, he saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was even more imposing than he remembered from childhood dares and whispered tales. A hulking, Gothic edifice of dark stone and decaying wood, its myriad windows like vacant, staring eyes. A single, flickering light seemed to emanate from one of the upper floors, a beacon of impossible illumination in the pervasive gloom. Dimp parked his van, the engine sputtering into silence, leaving him in a profound, unsettling quiet. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. He grabbed his heavy toolbox and his trusty headlamp, its beam cutting a stark path through the oppressive darkness. The massive oak front door, studded with rusted iron, creaked open before he even reached it. Elias Thorne stood in the threshold, a gaunt, stooped figure, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He wore a threadbare suit that seemed to hang on his skeletal frame. "Mr. Dimpleton?" Thorne rasped, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. "Welcome. Please, come in." The interior of Blackwood Manor was a mausoleum of dust and decay. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like ozone after a lightning strike. Cobwebs draped every surface like ancient lace. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long, dancing shadows. "The problem, Mr. Dimpleton," Thorne began, his voice barely above a whisper, "is inconsistent power and strange surges. The house, it has a mind of its own sometimes." Dimp scoffed internally. A mind of its own. He'd seen plenty of ancient wiring that seemed to have a mind of its own, usually a mind bent on self-destruction. "Where's your main panel?" Dimp asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous foyer. Thorne led him through a labyrinth of darkened hallways, each one colder than the last. Dimp's headlamp beam danced across peeling wallpaper, faded portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, and furniture draped in white sheets, like shrouded corpses. They finally reached a small, windowless room in the basement. The air here was even heavier, charged with an almost palpable energy. In the center of the room stood an ancient, cast-iron electrical panel, its fuses and switches a bewildering array of antique components. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that writhed on the walls. "This is it," Thorne said, gesturing with a bony hand. "It seems to pulse. Sometimes it goes dead. Sometimes it overloads." Dimp approached the panel cautiously. He pulled on his insulated gloves, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the unsettling atmosphere. He opened the panel door. Inside, the wiring was a tangled mess of cloth-wrapped conductors, some frayed, some blackened, all of it far older than any code allowed. But what truly caught his eye was a faint, almost imperceptible blue glow emanating from deep within the panel, behind the main bus bar. It pulsed, faintly, in time with the flickering bulb. "What's that glow?" Dimp asked, pointing with a gloved finger. Thorne's eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to gleam in the dim light. "An anomaly. It appeared some time ago. That's when the true problems began." Dimp reached for his multimeter, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tested the voltage, the amperage. The readings were wildly erratic, spiking and dropping with no discernible pattern. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its electrical system a chaotic circulatory network. As he worked, a chill ran down Dimp's spine that had nothing to do with the drafty basement. He heard it then, faint at first, a whisper like static electricity. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, guttural murmur that was almost, but not quite, words. "Just the old house settling," Dimp muttered to himself, trying to sound convincing. Then his wrench, which he had set down on a dusty workbench, slid slowly across the surface, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Dimp froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the wrench, then at Thorne, who stood perfectly still, his face impassive. "Did you see that?" Dimp asked, his voice tight. "See what, Mr. Dimpleton?" Thorne's voice was flat, devoid of surprise. Dimp shook his head. He must be tired, or the strange atmosphere of the house was getting to him. He picked up the wrench, his hand trembling slightly. He spent the next few hours meticulously tracing circuits, testing connections, trying to make sense of the electrical chaos. The blue glow behind the panel intensified, now a steady, unnerving throb. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though still unintelligible. They sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, murmuring in a language he couldn't comprehend. At one point, as he was examining a particularly corroded junction box. The bare bulb above him suddenly exploded with a deafening pop, showering him with glass shards. Dimp cried out, stumbling back. He instinctively shielded his eyes. When he looked up, the room was plunged into total darkness, save for the eerie blue pulse from the panel. What in God's name was that? Dimp gasped, his headlamp suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. Thorn's voice came from the darkness, closer than Dimp expected. The house, it doesn't like to be probed too deeply, Mr. Dimpleton. It resists. Dimp's rational mind was screaming. This wasn't just old wiring. This was something else. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He wanted to run, to sprint out of Blackwood Manor and never look back. But his electrician's pride and a perverse sense of duty kept him rooted. He had a job to do. He shone his headlamp into the open panel. The blue glow was now almost blinding, radiating an unnatural heat. He could see faint, ephemeral shapes swirling within the light, like smoke in a jar. And the whispers, they were clearer now, distinct voices, though still fragmented and distorted. He heard a woman scream, a child's sob, a man's guttural curse. They were sounds of terror, of pain. What is this place? Dimp whispered, his voice barely audible. Thorn stepped into the beam of his headlamp, his face illuminated in the stark light. His eyes were wide, almost manic. This house, Mr. Dimpleton, was built on a ley line, a powerful conduit of natural energy. And over the years, it has absorbed. It has become a vessel for the residual energies, the echoes, the souls. Dimp felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Souls? Mr. Thorn, I'm an electrician, not an exorcist. But you understand current, Mr. Dimpleton? Thorn said, his voice rising, a strange excitement in his tone. You understand how energy flows, how it can be harnessed. The blue light, it is the nexus, the point where the energies converge. I believe it can be controlled. Dimp stared at him, horrified. Controlled? What are you talking about? The power, Mr. Dimpleton. Thorn's voice was now a feverish whisper, the raw, untamed power within these walls. I have been trying to stabilize it, to direct it, to communicate. As Thorn spoke, the blue light pulsed faster, brighter. The whispers coalesced into a cacophony of screams and moans. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost unbearable static. Dimp's hair stood on end. He felt a tingling sensation on his skin, like 1,000 tiny needles. Suddenly, a surge of raw electrical energy shot through the panel. Dimp cried out as a jolt ripped through his body, despite his insulated gloves. He was thrown back, slamming against the dusty wall. His headlamp clattered to the floor, plunging the room into near-total darkness again, illuminated only by the frantic, blinding blue flashes from the panel. He lay there, stunned, his muscles spasming. He could hear Thorn laughing, a dry, cackling sound that filled the room. It responds. Thorn shrieked. It responds to the will. It recognizes the conduit. Dimp pushed himself up, his body aching. He saw Thorn standing before the panel, his arms outstretched, his face bathed in the pulsing blue light. He was muttering, chanting something in a language Dimp didn't recognize, his voice rising to a fever pitch. The wires in the panel began to writhe, sparking violently. The blue light pulsed with incredible intensity, now a solid, blinding beacon. Dimp saw the ephemeral shapes within the light coalesce, forming indistinct, spectral figures, their faces contorted in agony. They reached out, their translucent hands clawing at the air. He's trying to control them, Dimp realized, a horrifying clarity washing over him. He's trying to channel the dead. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to stop this. He was an electrician. This was an electrical problem, albeit one of a terrifying, supernatural nature. He scrambled for his tools, his hands fumbling in the near darkness. He found his heavy-duty wire cutters. He had to cut the main power, to sever the connection, As he moved towards the panel, a spectral hand, cold as ice, brushed against his cheek. He flinched, stumbling. The whispers were now screams, echoing directly in his mind, a chorus of tormented voices. "Stop him!" they shrieked. "Stop him! He feeds on us." Thorn turned, his eyes blazing with an unholy light. "You interfere, Mr. Dimpleton. You will be absorbed. You will join them." He lunged at Dimp, his bony fingers outstretched, crackling with faint blue energy. Dimp, fueled by a primal fear, dodged the attack. He raised his wire cutters, aiming for the main conduit, the thickest cable leading into the glowing nexus. Thorn shrieked, a sound of pure rage and frustration. He threw himself at Dimp again, but Dimp was faster. With a desperate heave, he brought the cutters down. Crack! A deafening explosion ripped through the basement. The blue light flared blindingly, then died. The screams of the spectral figures faded into a long, drawn-out wail that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Dimp's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. He lay there for a long moment, trembling, his body aching, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He slowly pushed himself up, fumbling for his headlamp. When its beam finally cut through the darkness, he saw the panel. It was charred, smoking, the wires severed, twisted, and melted. The blue glow was gone, and Thorn was gone. There was no trace of him. No body, no ash, nothing. Just a faint, lingering scent of ozone and something else. Something burnt and acrid. Dimp stumbled out of the basement, his legs like jelly. He didn't bother to close the panel, didn't bother to collect his other tools. He just needed to get out. He ran through the dark, silent hallways, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly. He didn't look back at the portraits, didn't listen for whispers. He burst out of the front door, gasping for air, the cold night air a welcome shock against his burning lungs. He scrambled into his van, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. He slammed the van into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and sped down the overgrown lane, not daring to glance in his rearview mirror. He drove for hours, not knowing where he was going, just needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and Blackwood Manor. He finally pulled over on the side of a deserted highway, the first faint hint of dawn painting the eastern sky. He sat there, shivering, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a terrifying, impossible film. He had seen things, heard things, felt things that defied all logic, all reason. He, Dimp, the meticulous, rational electrician, had faced the supernatural and he had survived. But he was changed, forever. The hum of transformers no longer sounded comforting. The snap of circuit breakers made him flinch. Every flickering light, every unexplained power surge, sent a jolt of primal fear through him. He saw shadows in the corners of his vision, heard faint whispers on the wind. He never took another call for an old house. He stuck to modern, predictable wiring, to the safe, logical flow of current. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet and the power lines hummed outside his window, he swore he could still see the faint, pulsing blue glow. And he knew with chilling certainty that the current that flowed through the world, the current he had dedicated his life to understanding, held secrets far darker, far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And sometimes he wondered if a part of Elias Thorne, a part of the tormented souls of Blackwood Manor, hadn't been absorbed into the very fabric of the electrical grid, waiting for the right conduit, the right surge to unleash themselves once more. And Dimp, the electrician, would always be listening for the hum, the whisper, the current that kills. The rain began just as the final bell shrieked, a sudden, cold downpour that turned the schoolyard into a blurry watercolor of gray asphalt and bright yellow raincoats. Alara pulled her thin, threadbare jacket tighter, hunching her shoulders against the biting chill as she joined the jostling throng of students rushing for the bus. She hated the bus. It was always too loud, too crowded, a suffocating metal box that smelled faintly of stale crisps, damp wool, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying grime. But today, a deeper, more profound unease settled in her stomach, a prickle of dread that had nothing to do with the weather or the usual afternoon crush. It was a cold, internal shiver that started in her gut and spread through her veins. The usual chaos of the afternoon bus ride was strangely muted, almost entirely absent. The boisterous laughter of the older boys, usually a cacophony of adolescent energy, was subdued, reduced to barely audible mumbles. The incessant chatter and playful shouts of the middle schoolers, typically a constant buzz, had dwindled to hushed, almost fearful whispers that seemed to cling to the damp air. Even the bus driver, old Mr. Henderson, usually a jovial man with a booming laugh and a penchant for bad jokes, sat hunched over the wheel, his shoulders stiff, his back unusually straight, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked road with an unusual, almost desperate intensity. The bus itself felt different, too. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with a life of their own, making the familiar interior seem alien and menacing. The engine hummed with a low, almost mournful whine, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards, up through Alara's worn sneakers, and into her very bones, a resonant thrum that felt less like machinery and more like a living, breathing thing. Alara found her usual seat, 3 rows from the back, by the window, where she could press her forehead against the cool glass and watch the world go by. Her best friend, Liam, usually saved it for her. His worn backpack sprawled across the seat, a silent invitation. But today Liam wasn't there. He hadn't been at school since Tuesday, and the teachers had just said he was unwell. Their voices tight, their eyes avoiding hers. Alara knew better. Liam had told her about the dreams, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with unshed tears, dreams of twisted trees reaching like skeletal hands from a perpetual mist, of whispering shadows that promised oblivion, of a cold, grasping hand reaching for him from the darkness beneath his bed. He'd looked pale and drawn, his usual spark dimmed to a flicker, like a candle about to gutter out. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, consumed by an invisible terror. As the bus pulled away from the school, the rain intensified, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green, transforming the familiar suburban landscape into an impressionistic blur. Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, trying desperately to distract herself, to focus on the distorted reflections of the streetlights, but her gaze kept drifting, irresistibly, to the other passengers. They seemed different. Their faces were pale, almost bloodless, their skin a sickly gray in the flickering light. Their eyes were wide and glassy, unnaturally still, fixed straight ahead, as if staring at something only they could see. They sat unnaturally stiff, their hands clasped tightly in their laps, their knuckles white, as if holding on to something precious, or perhaps holding themselves together, preventing some internal unraveling. Their breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. A small, whimpering sound, barely audible above the engine's drone, broke the heavy silence. Came from the seat directly in front of Alara. A first grader, little Timmy, was clutching a worn teddy bear, its once fluffy fur matted and damp. His face was buried deep in its comforting embrace, but his shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs that seemed to vibrate through the seat back. His older sister, Sarah, usually so protective of her little brother, sat rigidly beside him, staring blankly out the window, seemingly oblivious to his distress, her face a mask of serene emptiness. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dampness seeping into her jacket. It was the chill of fear, cold and sharp. She leaned forward, gently tapping Sarah on the shoulder, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Sarah, is Timmy okay? He's crying." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain-streaked window, unblinking, unseeing. Alara tapped her again, a little harder, a faint tremor in her hand. Still nothing. Sarah's skin looked unnaturally waxy, almost translucent, in the flickering, erratic light, like old porcelain. A faint, almost imperceptible greenish tint seemed to shimmer beneath the surface of her skin, visible only when the lights flared brightest. A sudden, violent lurch of the bus sent a ripple through the passengers. Not a normal bump in the road, but a deliberate, almost organic shift, as if the bus itself had sighed. A collective sigh, like a soft exhalation of breath from 1,000 lungs, swept through the bus, a faint, rustling sound that made the hairs on Alara's neck stand on end. Alara pulled back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. The bus continued its journey, taking what seemed to be the usual route, but each stop felt wrong, profoundly wrong. At the first stop, Mrs. Gable's house, a quaint cottage with a vibrant rose garden. No one got off. Mrs. Gable, a kindly old woman who always had a smile and a wave for the children, stood on her porch, a brightly colored umbrella clutched in her hand, her face pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea that Alara could almost feel. Mr. Henderson merely drove past, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if he hadn't even seen her. At the next stop, the corner where the twins, Emily and Ben, usually raced off the bus, laughing and shouting, their backpacks bouncing. Today, they remained in their seats, their identical faces expressionless, their eyes vacant, reflecting the flickering lights like polished stones. Their mother stood at the bus stop, a worried frown on her face that slowly morphed into a look of growing panic, then outright terror, as the bus sped by, leaving her standing alone in the rain. Alara felt a knot of ice forming in her stomach, expanding, spreading through her chest. The bus wasn't stopping. It was just driving, and the passengers, they weren't reacting. They were like dolls, frozen in place, their silent, glassy stares fixed on some unseen point in the distance, a destination known only to them. She tried to call out, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence, but her throat felt constricted, as if a cold, invisible hand was squeezing it, stealing her voice. She tried to move, to get up, to run to the front of the bus, but her limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if she were moving through thick mud, or as if she were submerged in cold, viscous water. A strange, metallic taste filled her mouth, like old pennies left too long in the rain, or the taste of blood. The humming of the bus engine grew louder, deeper, transforming into a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate inside her skull, a sound that was no longer mechanical but organic, alive. The fluorescent lights flickered faster, more violently, casting the interior of the bus in a strobe-like effect, making the still, pale faces of the passengers seem to twitch and distort, their features melting and reforming in the erratic light. The shadows danced, growing longer, reaching, twisting into grotesque shapes. Alara glanced at Timmy again. He was still whimpering, but now his whimpers were growing fainter, more distant, like an echo fading into nothingness. His teddy bear had slipped from his grasp, lying forgotten on the grimy floor. His eyes, once wide with tears, were now open, staring, and they held the same vacant, glassy quality as Sarah's, as everyone else's. The faint greenish tint on his skin was more pronounced now, like a delicate film of algae. A faint, sickly sweet smell, like the lingering scent of old flowers on a grave, or the cloying perfume of decay, began to permeate the air. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, then grew stronger, cloying, thick, making Alara's head swim, her stomach churn. It was the smell of something ancient, something that had been buried and was now stirring. She looked out the window again. The familiar houses and shops, the comforting landmarks of her neighborhood, had given way entirely to dense, unfamiliar woods. The trees were unnaturally tall and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted into grotesque, skeletal forms, their leaves a deep, unnatural green, even in the driving rain, shimmering with an internal light. This wasn't her neighborhood. This wasn't the way home. This was nowhere she had ever seen before. A low, guttural sound, like a deep sigh or a groan from the very earth, emanated from the front of the bus. Mr. Henderson. He was still hunched over the wheel, his grip unyielding, but his head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his neck twisted. His skin, visible at the nape of his neck and along his jawline, was no longer the healthy tanned color Ilara remembered. It was pale, almost translucent, and the faint, sickly green tint was now spreading rapidly across it, like moss growing on stone, deepening with every passing second. His eyes, in the rearview mirror, caught hers for a fleeting moment, and they glowed with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. The bus slowed, the engine's hum deepening into a resonant drone, then came to a gentle, almost imperceptible stop. Not at a bus stop, not on a paved road, but in the middle of a clearing in the dark, ancient woods. The rain had ceased, as if on command, and an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the bus engine and the faint, unsettling hum that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a low, hypnotic vibration. The bus door hissed open, not onto the usual asphalt and pavement, but onto a path of dark, damp earth, winding deeper into the woods, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. The air outside was thick with the cloying, sweet smell, now almost overpowering, a suffocating perfume that filled Ilara's lungs. One by one, the passengers began to stir, not with a sudden jolt, not with the awakening of consciousness, but with a slow, deliberate movement, like puppets whose strings were being gently pulled by an unseen hand. They rose from their seats, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, their limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Their glassy eyes, still fixed straight ahead, held no recognition, no emotion, only that unsettling, blank stare. Timmy, his small body stiff and unyielding, stood up, his hand reaching out for Sarah's. Sarah, in turn, took his hand, her grip unnaturally firm, her fingers intertwining with his with a disturbing precision. They began to file out of the bus, a silent, ghostly procession of pale, unblinking children and teenagers, their faces devoid of emotion, their movements like automatons. They walked slowly, deliberately, down the path into the dark woods, their forms disappearing one by one into the deepening shadows, swallowed by the ancient trees. Ilara watched them go, paralyzed by a terror that rooted her to her seat, a fear so profound it stole her breath. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide, to claw her way back to the world she knew, but her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles felt like lead, her will trapped within her own skull. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, a bitter tang, and the faint, sickly green tint she had seen on Mr. Henderson's neck seemed to shimmer at the edges of her vision, encroaching, consuming. Then a voice, not a human voice, not a whisper, but a soft, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate from the very air around her, from the seats, from the floor, from the walls of the bus itself, from the engine, from the trees outside. It was the same tuneless, repetitive melody she had heard the little girl humming in her dreams, the one Liam had described, a melody that was both ancient and utterly alien. Come, the hum whispered, 1,000 voices in one, soft and inviting, yet filled with an ancient, unspeakable hunger, a promise of absorption, of becoming. It's time for your last stop. It's time to join us. Ilara felt her own limbs begin to stiffen, a creeping paralysis spreading from her toes upwards, her head tilted to the side, involuntarily, her gaze fixing on the open bus door, on the dark path leading into the heart of the woods. Her eyes, she realized with a dawning horror that was quickly fading, were no longer focusing. They were becoming still, glassy, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights with an unnerving intensity, mirroring the eyes of those who had gone before her. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that was not her own. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger, yet no longer unpleasant, but strangely comforting, familiar. The sickly sweet scent filled her lungs, not cloying now, but a soothing, intoxicating perfume. The green tint was spreading, a cool, soothing sensation across her skin, a transformation that felt less like a curse and more like a homecoming. She stood up, her movements stiff, deliberate like the others. She walked down the aisle, her bare feet. When had she taken off her shoes? She couldn't remember. Making no sound on the grimy floor, her steps silent, precise. She passed Mr. Henderson, still hunched over the wheel, his head now fully turned, his eyes glowing with the same unsettling green light as the trees outside. He looked at her, and a silent, knowing hum resonated from him, a greeting, a welcome to their collective. Alara stepped off the bus, onto the damp earth, the cool soil yielding beneath her feet. The air was cool against her skin, and the hum of the woods enveloped her, a lullaby, a welcome, a chorus of 1,000 silent voices. She joined the silent procession, her steps falling into rhythm with theirs, her gaze fixed on the winding path, on the glowing green eyes that awaited her in the shadows. She felt no fear, no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of peace, of belonging. She was going home, to her new home, to join the others. The bus, its engine still thrumming with that low, resonant hum, sat silently in the clearing, its lights flickering, waiting for the next group of passengers. The last stop was never truly the last. It was just the beginning of a new journey, into the heart of the woods, into the silent, green embrace of the ancient, hungry things that waited there. And soon, another bus would arrive, another group of children, ready for their own last stop. The wind, a mournful lament, snaked through the skeletal branches of the whispering woods, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unsettling, like the breath of a forgotten tune. Sir Kalen, his armor a dull gleam beneath the perpetually overcast sky, tightened his grip on his sword hilt, the cold steel a small comfort against the creeping unease. Beside him, Sir Gareth, younger and less scarred by the world, shivered despite the thick wool beneath his mail and the arduous pace. His breath plumed in the chill air, a fleeting ghost against the oppressive gloom. "This place, it breathes," Gareth murmured, his voice barely a whisper against the wind's sigh, which seemed to carry faint, unintelligible murmurs from the depths of the forest. "It feels alive, in a way no forest should." Kalen grunted, his gaze sweeping the gnarled, twisted trees that pressed in on all sides, their branches interweaving into a dense, oppressive canopy that allowed only slivers of bruised light to penetrate. "Aye, and what it breathes is ill. Keep your eyes sharp, lad." The report spoke of disappearances, not just bandits. Farmers, hunters, even a patrol of the king's own men. They vanished without a trace, as if the very earth swallowed them whole. They were on a holy quest, or so the High Council had decreed, their mandate delivered with solemn faces and hushed tones. Children, mostly, vanishing from villages bordering the woods, leaving no trace but a chilling silence, a void where laughter and innocent cries once echoed. The local folk, their faces etched with fear and superstition, spoke of old gods stirring from slumber beneath the earth, of shadows that walked on two legs and whispered promises of eternal slumber, of trees that wept and bled. Kalen, a veteran of countless skirmishes against human foes, a man who had faced down charging cavalry and roaring beasts without flinching, felt a prickle of unease that no battle had ever inspired. This was different. This was unnatural. It was a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his bones, colder than the damp air. They had been tracking for 3 days, pushing deeper into the heart of the whispering woods, following faint, almost imperceptible signs that only Kalen's seasoned eye could discern. Broken twigs that lay in unnatural patterns, a disturbed patch of moss where no animal should have trod, the lingering scent of something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit mixed with grave dirt and something metallic, like old blood. The woods grew denser with each league, the light fading to a perpetual twilight, even at midday. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching, grasping, their ancient roots snaking across the forest floor like slumbering serpents. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences, and the only sounds were the ceaseless sigh of the wind and the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the decaying leaves. On the 4th day, the silence deepened, becoming an almost tangible thing. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small creatures, the distant calls of larger beasts had faded entirely. It was as if the woods themselves held their breath, waiting. And then they found her. She sat by the base of an enormous ancient oak, its bark a mosaic of deep furrows and strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in their peripheral vision, as if drawn by an unseen hand. The girl was small, no older than 7, her dress torn and muddied, her bare feet caked with grime and clinging leaves. Her hair, a tangled mess of flaxen strands, obscured much of her face, but even from a distance, Kaylin could sense something profoundly wrong. She was humming a tuneless, repetitive melody, a sound that was both childlike and profoundly disturbing, a simple, looping refrain that seemed to resonate with the very silence of the woods. Little one, Kaylin's voice was gentle, a stark contrast to the clang of his armor and the grim set of his jaw. He approached cautiously, his hand still on his sword, his instincts screaming at him to be wary. She looked up. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, and utterly devoid of fear. They were the color of polished obsidian, reflecting the dim light of the woods with an unsettling intensity, like two dark, bottomless pools. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You came," she said, her voice soft, like rustling leaves in a forgotten breeze, yet it carried an echo that seemed to fill the vast space of the woods, reverberating in their very bones. "I knew you would," Gareth gasped, his hand flying to his mouth, a mixture of relief and dawning horror on his face. "By the saints, she's alive! A miracle!" He started to rush forward, but Kaylin's hand shot out, stopping him. "Are you hurt, child?" Kaylin knelt, trying to meet her gaze, but her obsidian eyes seemed to look through him, beyond him, as if seeing something he could not. There was no sign of injury on her, no tears, no fear, only that unnerving calm. She shook her head slowly, her flaxen hair swaying. "No." "I'm waiting. Waiting for what, little one?" Gareth asked, stepping closer, his initial relief warring fiercely with a nascent unease that was rapidly growing into full-blown dread. The girl's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed a shade too sharp, too numerous for a child, like tiny, pearlescent needles. For them, they like new friends, especially ones who carry shiny things. Her gaze flickered to Kaylin's sword, then to Gareth's, a hungry, ancient light in her dark eyes. As if on cue, a sudden, piercing shriek tore through the air, not from the girl, but from deep within the woods. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that made the hair stand up on Kaylin's arms, a sound that spoke of flesh tearing and bones snapping. It was followed by a wet, sickening thud. "What was that?" Gareth demanded, his face paling, his hand instinctively gripping his sword hilt. The girl giggled, a sound that grated on Kaylin's nerves, a sound devoid of innocence, filled instead with a chilling amusement. "They're playing. They always play before they eat." Before Kaylin could react, before he could even process the full implication of her words, the ground beneath them began to heave. It wasn't a tremor, but a deliberate, organic movement. Roots, thick as a man's thigh, erupted from the earth, coiling and twisting like monstrous serpents, tearing through the damp soil with a sound like tearing cloth. The enormous, ancient oak behind the girl seemed to groan, its massive bark rippling as if alive, and the strange, swirling patterns on its trunk began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in time with the girl's incessant humming. "Get back, Gareth!" Kaylin roared, drawing his sword with a practiced, deadly hiss of steel. He knew with a sudden, terrible certainty that they had walked into a trap. Gareth stumbled backward, tripping over a newly risen root, his armor clanking loudly. He scrambled to his feet, his own sword drawn, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the shifting shadows between the trees. From those shadows, from the very fabric of the woods, they emerged. Not beasts, not men, but something in between, something that defied easy categorization. figures tall and gaunt, their limbs unnaturally long and spindly, like twisted branches, their skin like stretched, ancient bark, mottled with moss and fungi. Their heads were smooth, featureless, save for two glowing green orbs where eyes should be, burning with an internal cold fire, and a wide, lipless maw that seemed to pulsate with an inner light, revealing no teeth, only a dark, endless void. They moved with a disturbing fluidity, silent as shadows, yet radiating an aura of immense, ancient power, a primordial malevolence that made the air crackle. "The tree folk of legend," Gareth whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible. "But they're real, and they're not friendly." The girl, still sitting calmly by the base of the oak, clapped her hands, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Her unsettling smile was fixed on the approaching horrors, a look of profound satisfaction on her face. "See, I told you they'd come. They love visitors." Kalen knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these were not creatures to be fought with steel alone. They were something else, something from a forgotten age, guardians of this cursed wood, or perhaps its very manifestation. But he was a knight, sworn to protect the innocent, sworn to face down evil, no matter its form. He would not yield. "Protect the child," Kalen shouted, his voice ringing with a false bravado, though a part of him, a small, terrified voice, wondered if the child was the one who needed protecting, or if she was the bait, the spider at the center of this monstrous web. The tree folk moved with terrifying speed, a silent, deadly ballet of bark and glowing eyes. One, taller and more sinuous than the others, lunged at Gareth, its long skeletal arm extending, its hand ending in razor-sharp talons that resembled sharpened roots, capable of tearing flesh and bone. Gareth parried, his sword clanging against the creature's woody flesh, a sound like stone striking stone. But the impact sent a jarring shockwave up his arm, numbing his fingers. The creature merely recoiled slightly, its glowing eyes unwavering. Kalen engaged another, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. He swung his sword in a wide arc, aiming for its featureless head, but the creature swayed, its body blurring, its form seeming to dissolve into the shadows for a fraction of a second, and his blade passed through empty air. It was like fighting a phantom, a nightmare made flesh, solid one moment, intangible the next. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and decay, a sickly sweet aroma that made his stomach churn. The green light from the oak intensified, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch like living things, distorting reality. The girl's humming grew louder, more insistent, weaving itself into the very fabric of the woods, a hypnotic, maddening drone that burrowed into Kalen's mind, threatening to shatter his sanity. One of the tree folk, faster and more cunning than the others, darted past Kalen, its movements a blur, heading straight for the girl. Kalen roared, turning to intercept, but he was too slow, his armor weighing him down. The creature reached her, its taloned hand extended, but instead of seizing her, it gently touched her cheek, its rough, bark-like fingers surprisingly delicate. The girl leaned into the touch, her eyes closing, her smile serene, a picture of disturbing contentment. The tree folk then turned its glowing gaze back to the knights, and a low, guttural growl, like the grinding of ancient stones, or the roots of the earth shifting, emanated from its maw, a sound of immense, terrible satisfaction. "She's one of them," Gareth gasped, his face a mask of dawning horror, his voice cracking with the realization. "She's not a victim, she's a lure. They sent her." The realization struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow, a cold, crushing weight in his chest. All the missing children, the whispers, the unnatural silence. They weren't taken, they were transformed, or perhaps they were born of this place, ancient seeds sprouting into human form, sent out to draw new souls into the maw of the woods, to replenish the forest's macabre harvest. The tree folk pressed their attack, their movements becoming more aggressive, more coordinated, a silent, deadly dance of hunters and prey. Kalen fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his blade a blur, a desperate flash of defiance against the overwhelming tide. But for every one he managed to strike, another seemed to materialize from the shadows, or the one he struck would simply reform, its woody flesh knitting back together with an unsettling speed. The acidic scent in the air grew stronger, burning his nostrils, making his eyes water. He could feel it stinging his exposed skin, a faint, burning itch. Gareth, overwhelmed by the sheer number and unnatural speed of the creatures, was forced back against the gnarled trunk of a smaller tree, its bark rough against his mail. A tree folk, its glowing eyes burning into his soul, advanced, its talons poised, its lipless maw opening slightly, emitting a faint, resonant hum. Gareth screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror and agony, as the creature's hand closed around his face, its sharp talons digging into his flesh. He thrashed, his struggles desperate but futile, his movements growing weak, his screams fading into choked gasps. Kalen watched in horror, helpless, as Gareth's body began to contort, his armor groaning and splitting under the unnatural transformation. His skin darkened, taking on a rough, bark-like texture, his limbs elongated, stretching and twisting into grotesque, branch-like forms. His screams turned into a wet, gurgling croak, then a series of low, guttural hums that mirrored the girl's melody. The green light from the oak pulsed brighter, and Gareth's eyes, once filled with human fear, began to glow with the same unsettling green as the tree folk, reflecting the ancient malevolence of the woods. He was changing, becoming one of them, his humanity dissolving, replaced by the essence of the forest's horror. Kalen felt a cold dread seep into his very bones, chilling him to the core. He was alone, surrounded by ancient, malevolent entities, and a child who was their silent, terrifying accomplice, a puppet master pulling invisible strings. He knew he could not win this fight. His sword was useless against such a foe, his strength meaningless against their ancient power. He looked at the girl, still sitting calmly, her eyes now open, watching Gareth's transformation with an almost scientific detachment, a quiet fascination. Her smile was wider now, more knowing, more chilling, a silent promise of what awaited him. "You're next," she whispered, her voice soft, yet carrying over the sounds of the struggle, a promise of inevitable doom, a final, chilling invitation. Kalen, his breath ragged, his body screaming with exhaustion and fear, made a desperate decision. He would not be another victim, another grotesque addition to this cursed forest. He would not become one of them. He would not join Gareth in this living death. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, a final, primal instinct for survival, he turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape this place, this living nightmare. He ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth, his armor snagging on thorns, his breath rasping in his throat. The tree folk pursued him, their silent, fluid movements unnervingly fast, their glowing eyes burning holes in the darkness behind him. He could hear the rustle of their bark-like skin, the faint, high-pitched hum of their inner light drawing closer, closer. He burst through a thicket of thorns, tearing his armor, scratching his skin, leaving trails of blood on the sharp branches, but he didn't feel the pain. His mind was consumed by one thought: escape, escape or die. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs ached with exhaustion, until every muscle screamed in protest. The trees began to thin, the oppressive canopy giving way to patches of less dense forest, the light growing brighter, a faint, hopeful glimmer in the distance. He stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the damp earth of a familiar path, gasping for breath, his body trembling violently. He lay there for a long time, listening, his heart pounding against his ribs. The wind still whispered, but it was a different whisper now, a less malevolent one, the sounds of a normal forest slowly returning. The unsettling silence of the woods was replaced by the distant chirping of crickets, the rustle of normal leaves, the hoot of an owl. He was out. He had escaped. He had survived. But as he pushed himself up, his body aching, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed, he felt a strange sensation on his skin. A tingling, a faint itch, like something crawling beneath the surface. He looked down at his hands, caked with mud and blood. His skin, where the thorns had scratched him, was not bleeding freely. Instead, a faint, sickly green tint was beginning to spread from the cuts, like a bruise, slowly darkening, growing rougher. And his fingers, they seemed a fraction longer, a fraction more slender than he remembered, the nails hardening, thickening. He stared at his reflection in a shallow puddle, his heart seizing in his chest, a new, terrible dread eclipsing the old. His eyes, though still human, held a faint, unsettling glimmer of gold, a reflection of the ancient light he had seen in the depths of the woods. The girl's voice, soft and echoing, seemed to whisper in his mind, a chilling lullaby. You came, they like new friends, and now, you are one of us. He had escaped the woods, but the woods had not finished with him. The horror had followed him, seeped into his very being, a slow, insidious poison. He was not free. He was merely transforming. And soon, when the change was complete, he would find himself drawn back to the whispering woods, not as a knight, but as something else, something new, something that hummed a tuneless, repetitive melody and waited patiently for new friends. The horror had just begun, and Kalen, the valiant knight, was now its unwitting harbinger.